Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Truglia, and with me today is the Brady Bunch, or otherwise the Prot Gang. Represent Prot Gang. We got Father James, we got the other Paul, and we got River, who that last name should be easy to pronounce, but I have issues. How are you guys?
Good.
Excellent.
Good, well.
And so this is a response video, not to Dr. Gavin Ortlund, as everyone expects, because he made a video to me, but rather a video to, look, there's Trent Horn. And the reason I wanted to do this, because I think people get so caught up in these controversies between the apologists that they stop listening to what people are actually saying. And we need to take the time to actually listen to what people are saying, to actually evaluate the arguments. Because let's just be perfectly honest, guys. Christian apologetics is in a crisis. Most apologists treat this like a business. It's all about Patreons and clicks. I think the audiences have grown increasingly effeminate, and they're motivated by controversies. It's like a cross between a soap opera and WWE, and not for nothing, I don't like either of those things, and so it really has no business in apologetics. Intellectual debate should not be reduced to a dissing contest. And so while I think a lot of people would make hay out of the situation I just was in, right? I was called out by someone way bigger than me. Oh, I gotta go make hay and make a video about how lousy his arguments supposedly are. I have deliberately not even watched his video. So don't ask for my response. I have not watched it yet, because I tend to respond when people will actually pay attention to what I say and not merely listen for controversy's sake. All right. So I did pay attention when Trent Horn and Jimmy Akin made their own response video, and I felt it was professional and par for the course. I also felt that it was typical Roman Catholic fare from an Orthodox perspective, because that's the perspective I speak from. And so I find that problematic. And sometimes in some respects, as we'll go over in this response video, more problematic than even some of the Protestant cases that Dr. Gavin Ortlund was making. And so in this video, we'll be talking about the issues that the Roman Catholic side makes in discussing this issue and errors. And honestly, this is not about refuting our guest that we have here today. So it's about everyone exacting scrutiny on the arguments that were made by Jimmy Akin and Trent Horn. And I think it's worth saying that I've had Trent Horn on my channel. We had a really good show on why you're not Protestant. No offense, guys. We're yet to be refuted. I heard Father James and you, the other Paul, were supposed to make a refutation video, but apparently it's irrefutable. So that shows you how good.
And we're just too embarrassed.
Yeah. So there you go. So it just shows you how good the video was. And Trent Horn, as you guys know, you've had him off the air as well. He's just a stand-up guy, a really good guy. And so I feel that in doing this video, we need to keep that in mind. We're dealing with good human beings, but that doesn't always mean they make good arguments. And the same could obviously apply to me. And so I think people thought I was going to embrace their video, and people actually, their first responses to my critique was like, what are you talking about? What's wrong? It's like, everything's wrong. That's the problem. Everything's wrong with this video. And I think if people actually listened to what people said, they would have identified some of the problems here. Yep. And so I put together a list of critiques and a esteemed team of Protestant critics so that people would see a critique of Horn and Akin from an unlikely source, that is me. And I think that if people do that, they'll be able to more critically interact also with Dr. Gavin Ortlund's work and my work. And I'll just leave it at this. More is a-coming, but I'm not going to jump into it, not because you already see the stuff I've wrote in my blog, but because I want to deal with this in a very thorough manner. Now, my last comments, just particularly about what Dr. Ortlund has come up with, is that he really does get the better of Trent Horn and Jimmy Akin, I think, in this exchange. And this is very surprising. It shows you how strong the case of a typical general case. Obviously, I think I have a better case, but Dr. Ortlund's case is so strong because he had the first say. Usually the people that have the second say and poke all the holes, They don't come out looking better. I think the fact that he had much shorter video and comes out looking much stronger compared to much longer video whose intent is to just poke holes and everything shows he's just made a much stronger case. He's done a better job raising up points based on much scholarship. And I think they hold up better and will be more convincing to general audiences. I think that the arguments made by Trent Horn and Jimmy Akin are mostly in-house arguments. They're just circling of the wagons. And for all you young bucks out there that don't know how we old people talk, circling the wagons means it's a defensive measure where the wagons are all together, the same people going to Oregon, and the engines are coming, and now they circle the wagons to defend themselves. And so if you're part of that group, right, then the circling the wagons defends yourself, but it really does nothing to convince the other side. There's a lot in what they bring up which would be utterly unconvincing to the Protestant or to the questioning Roman Catholic or to the questioning Orthodox Christian. It's essentially in-house defense of Romanist epistemology of development, and not convincing unless you want to buy into it. And this is how we ought not to defend icons. That's my agenda. That's my axe to grind, despite how much I respect Trent Horn. We'll just have to agree to disagree. I think there's major epistemic differences how we approach this. And this is what Orthodox have to defend. We Orthodox cannot take the lazy way out and try to defend half measures. Orthodox consider iconodulia the historical faith of the church. Its adherence is necessary for salvation and must be able to be defended from the saints, must be able to be defended from history. And if we can't, then we have to say we believe it's historical, we believe it's necessary salvation, but maybe I don't have the best arguments, or maybe I don't have the best scholarship, and we have to have humility. But what we cannot back down from is the Orthodox conviction that it's the historical faith and absolutely necessary for salvation. So that being said, I know that's not how you feel, but that is the traditional and correct Orthodox take. And so I want to give each of you guys about a minute to answer this question, because I think it will sum up your overall views before we start unpacking the contents of their response video, which is, in respect to clergy, Father James will go first. Who got the better end of it? Akin and Horn or Dr. Ortlund?
Well, so I'm in between being that barely Protestant middle one and all that sort of stuff. I would side more with Gavin Ortlund insofar as I do believe that veneration gets to a development, and I know I'll disagree with you on that part. However, I would also side in the middle, be more in the middle in this, the idea that there is a limitation of veneration, which I think is all right when it comes to iconography, sacred objects, sacred images, and things like that. Which we're going to get more and more into. But I would ultimately disagree with Nicaea II, even though I agree with Nicaea II on its incarnational theology and the appropriateness of images given the incarnation.
10 seconds. Who got the better end, Dr. Ortlund or the Catholic team?
Ortlund.
All right. Now, the other Paul, because you're working on my documentary and I got to make you happy so it gets done. What is your take? Who got the better end of it, Ortlund or Akin and Horn?
Yeah, I genuinely do think Ortlund got the better end of it, because there are multiple points in the doco where, multiple points in their response. When you look at their response and look at not just what Dr. Ortlund said, but even what Dr. Ortlund said in the very clips they provide, they just don't match up. A key example being Dr. Ortlund talking about there's no distinction between veneration and worship with respect to images in the Old Testament, and then Akin just says he denies veneration and worship distinction period in Scripture, which is absolutely not what Dr. Ortlund argues, among multiple other points. And then even with their other arguments, which Dr. Ortlund doesn't address directly, because obviously he's making his own videos, not responding to them, they're responding after him. Even in those, it's very easy to see how the reasoning and the reasoning and evidence provided by Dr. Ortlund is not touched by that, or at bare minimum, you can see how Dr. Ortlund can very easily respond to what they say.
Good work often preempts potential criticisms, I think, and I think he's done that well.
He has.
And we'll give John Colarafi, one of my frequent guests, traditional Catholic. He has to say doctrinal development is not Catholic doctrine, but it's popular with the pop apologist. And I don't know what that AFAIK means. I guess young bucks like John know the slang better than I do. That sounds legit. So that being said, River, what's your say on this issue?
Yeah, I think Gavin has had the better video. I think that Trent and Jimmy seemed to be on the defensive, and they seem to be a little rattled. So their response to Gavin's use of the fathers seemed to be pretty odd, and they were kind of saying, "Oh, this is forged. This doesn't say that. This doesn't mean that." They seemed like they were kind of trying to wriggle out of it, and then they ended up having to make some pretty bizarre points about how the New Testament U-turns the Old Testament and all kinds of weird things. It seemed like a big cope, to be honest. Whereas Gavin seemed to be more confident and had a stronger case. But also, I completely agree, like, even beyond the fact that I agree with Gavin's position, I would agree with Gavin anyway that the issue of the veneration of images is incredibly important. And the fact that Jimmy and Trent made this very long video but was saying, "Oh, it doesn't matter," seemed to be pretty weird. It does matter quite a lot, which I think the four of us will all agree on that for sure, I imagine.
And we'll get into that, because obviously as an Orthodox Christian, I'd have to defend, like, no, this is absolutely important. It's not some superfluous council. You know, we don't condemn everyone every Lent because they don't venerate icons, because it's no big deal. And we'll get into these details. We'll go down the list of critiques. Sadly, we'll have to go around the horn there, and we will alternate with who gives a response for the Protestant side. I'll give the Orthodox side, and hopefully we'll get a good, well-rounded view of the arguments that were given, their limitations, and we'll take it from there. And so I'm going to start with number one, guys, and I'll make my camera bigger for a moment, which is they said that icons are devotional and they developed centuries afterwards. And our viewers here have been quoting Slap Some Newman on it and showing love for the other Paul, his great video, his meme on what's that magical tape that, or flex is tape. It like flex tape that, you know, Newman's just the epistemic flex tape of Roman Catholic apologetics.
And credit to a Goy for Jesus or Jeff Robinson for he came up with the phrase, just slap some Newman on it. So it was inspired by him.
But that's essentially really the premise of this video. And Cardinal Henry Newman has a very compelling epistemology. It works. It's eternally consistent, logically speaking. And I actually appreciate that in the application of Newman's epistemology, and in defense of it, even without him being named, that Trent Horn and Jimmy Akin essentially said, yeah, the icons didn't exist for several centuries, right? And so, like, when I quote Father Gorino saying, you know, yes, Newman rejected that the Theotokos was originally venerated, that this developed over centuries, and the veneration of the saints, that is. This is not a misapplication of the epistemology of doctrinal development. This is what Roman Catholics believe by doctrinal development. And this is not, for example, how Orthodox view doctrine. And there's other videos and other venues where we critique whether this epistemology is all that compelling. Because like I said, it's eternally consistent. But my point would be this. Why would a questioning Roman Catholic or a questioning Orthodox Christian or a Protestant take seriously the veneration of icons if it's not actually an apostolic doctrine? You can say, well, it's apostolic because it's logically consistent with the apostles. But then why have these arguments that the episcopacy is something original in the church and that the deuterocanon is something that's original in the church, and all these arguments that Roman Catholic apologetics usually hinge upon, but the icons in Nicaea II, yeah, that this really has nothing to do with the early church. It just developed over centuries. It's just logically consistent. If I were a Protestant, I'd hear that and I go, I'd prefer to be part of a church that at least tries to get what the apostles had taught. That actually looks and acts like the original church. Now, as an Orthodox Christian, I don't think any Protestant church can make that claim. But the point is, I could see why that would be utterly unconvincing. And it's, as I referred to before, it's purely a circling the wagons move. Because the idea is, well, we got to make Catholics not jump off the ship. So we're going to say, well, yes, what Dr. Ortlund said is right, but it doesn't matter that it's right, because the correct way of looking at this is that it's totally legitimate. It developed over centuries. And I think that's just question begging, because bad things could develop over centuries. By that logic, the Protestant Reformation was the logical development of Roman Catholicism and took it all in a more better, positive direction. There's nothing logically inconsistent about that. And so I just think, without even getting to the logical constraints, the historical absurdity of the epistemology, I just say it's just self-refuting. You know, you can just as easily be Protestant and hold to doctrinal development. And so that being said, I'm going to go first to Father James because he's clergy. Do you have any thoughts on this, or you want to pass it?
Yeah, if I could add a little bit to that. So if you'll notice, as we're going through this video, we're going to hear a lot of sort of, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be understood this way, or it could be translated another way, or, well, you know, even though the consensus of the scholars say X, well, you know, maybe because of this one anecdotal reason, it could be understood as Y, and all that sort of stuff. And it becomes a problem, especially when you're trying to argue and engage academically. This is very clearly apologetics. This is not a sort of academic video that's being done by them, where it's just sort of, we're giving sort of positive arguments for why we believe what we believe. It is all a lot of, well, it doesn't necessarily, it's logically possible for us to sort of wiggle that worm through this way and that way to get it to be understood this way. And you're just going to see a lot of that in this video.
Now, I just want to give a brief moment for the other Paul, because he did slap some Newman on it. Do you have any observations you want to make on this point?
Yeah, well, I'd say that in fairness to the iconodual side, that if the claim was just that icon veneration is consistent with divine revelation, and if they granted, well, yeah, it developed centuries later, I wouldn't see an issue with that. The big problem comes with the fact that their historical church has claimed, in accepting the Second Council of Nicaea, that this was a practice going back to the apostles, which is why they then have to do the whole, they have to pull an Anastasius and say, oh, well, that part of the council isn't infallible. But
see, it all starts connecting.
Exactly. Together, watch that video, people. It's amazing. So if it was just that, it'd be fine. But since their council has fundamentally rooted the practice of icon veneration, not merely in being, oh, well, it's consistent with what we can do and it's a cool practice. If that was it, I wouldn't be screeching as hard as I do against idolatry. But the fact that they actually claim that an essential core foundation of it is the fact that it's an apostolic practice, that's where the big problem comes along. And I'll say that to kind of give some nuance to Father James's comments, is that there's definitely a distinction between apologetics and academics. And I think apologetics, I think everyone would agree, apologetics can be done in an academic manner. It can be done in a great, very academic manner. There's just a distinction in aim, whereas purely academic stuff isn't concerned with like trying to argue against position and fervently defend one. It's just trying to say, here's what the sources say, here's some good reasoning. Whereas apologetics is more directly aimed at defense or attack of something. But they can come together. But unfortunately, I will concur with Father James here that this is an example of apologetics with very poor academic standards. And I think this will be made clear, especially as we get into how they treat the primary sources.
All right. Now you made your point. We got to keep this moving or we're not going to get all the points in. So thank you.
That was me
and we will cover the issue infallibility. Don't you worry. I'm going to cover the next issue, which is the idea that icons are secondary. Now, I could have maybe misunderstood their point. So 3 guys interrupt if I'm getting this wrong. Say, no, Craig, you don't get it. But it sounded to me they're saying icons are secondary. They're not like this primary part of the faith, and that's why they weren't apostolic, and it took centuries.
Tertiary.
And it's like they're less important. They're secondary. That's why the apostles didn't teach it. So it took time for it to come because it's secondary in importance. And this is just this idea of ranking what's infallible, ranking what's dogmatic. It's just not how Orthodox deal with theology. It comes across very bizarre to me. Maybe it makes more sense in the Roman Catholic paradigm, but I haven't heard this in traditional Catholicism, the idea that Nicaea II is some sort of secondary council or something to that effect. So it seems to me that it's this purposeful watering down of Nicaea II to make it more palatable for Protestants. Say, this is secondary, it's not as important, that's why it didn't come across as quickly. If you're not as convinced, it's because you don't need to be as convinced. and it's an intentional lowering of the bar to convince someone to pretty much get an apologetics win. And I think it's a kind of defensive measure because of just how strong the attack that Dr. Ortlund made was, right? And it comes across as weakness to me and not defensible epistemically if we're going to look at how the church has understood itself in the early church. And so that's my view on it. The other Paul talked a lot there. So River, do you have anything you want to add or you want to pass it?
Yeah, no, I want to talk about that. So obviously, we're going to disagree, Craig, about whether or not the Old Testament's prohibitions against idolatry apply to the veneration of images. But if, someone has to be able to understand with charity that for a Protestant, if we believe that venerating images is idolatry, it's absolutely a first order issue that and it impacts your salvation, as you yourself have said, Craig. Throughout the Old Testament, it is completely undeniable that God is very concerned with idolatry. He wants people to be put to death if they are idolaters. And the fact that the Israelites were brought into exile and that Jerusalem was sacked was specifically because of the sin of idolatry. And then even into the New Testament, you see in 1 Thessalonians 1:9, where Paul kind of describes the idea of conversion to Christianity as turning from worthless idols to serve the true and living God. So if venerating images is idolatry, it's an absolutely first order issue. And even so, that's the Protestant perspective on it, where we would say that if you're someone who is venerating things and that's idolatry, then you basically don't have a reasonable hope of salvation. From an Orthodox perspective, it comes down to things about denying the incarnation, and that those sorts of issues, and also just rejecting the church, since the church has dogmatically and infallibly declared in Nicaea II that this is the faith of the apostles. Of course, I don't have that perspective, but whichever side you're on, Nicaea II makes it first order anyway. You just can't get around it. So I did feel like that was a bit strange that they would say that it's like a secondary issue, because even during the Reformation, right, there are lots of the iconoclast movements in the Reformation was a pretty big deal. It was a big issue between Protestants and Catholics. We can't say it doesn't matter, because it does matter.
You're
on mute, Greg.
All right, high quality production here. So let me go on the next topic, because I think it's connected to what you just said, River, which is to quote them. They said Roman Catholics don't have to venerate icons, which, I don't know, again, as an Orthodox Christian, sounds pretty bizarre. We're positively commanded to venerate the icons. Nicaea II condemns those who don't. We're going to get into, the next point we'll get into their anathema thing. The Uniates, just like the Orthodox every Lent, condemn those ritually, as Joshua Shupin likes to say, ritually condemn those who don't, and curse those who don't venerate the icons. So it is, to me, very, very strange to say that this is something negotiable in some way. My view is that, regularly speaking, I'm not a bishop, I'm not a priest, I don't make individual decisions for what they do to bring families into churches and stuff like that. But normatively, people should not be brought to the Orthodox Church unless they will venerate the icons and venerate the saints. This is not negotiable for the Orthodox. This is not negotiable for many reasons, because this is not a response to Protestant ideas. I'll just say, when you start listening to the objections to the veneration of icons, veneration of saints, I do think, and this has not spin a heresy wheel, I do think we start coming to issues where we compromise the integrity of saints and the integrity of Christ's human nature. And I would maybe in another show argue that point, but that would be my legitimate concern. But I want to bring the legitimate concerns of our esteemed guest, Father James. Because Father James, for instance, says, listen, I'm kind of cool with Nicaea. Just don't make it where you totally have to force people to do it. So let me ask you this then, Father. Are you convinced by Trent and Jimmy Akin? Can you get down the Roman Catholic Church as saying you don't have to?
I'm convinced that you don't have to, but not because of Jimmy Akin and Trent.
Why not?
I just don't believe that that's consistent with Roman theology, because Nicaea II. I don't want to mix those two. But Nicaea II does require, on pain of anathema, that you, I think it says specifically kiss, bow or prostrate and kiss. Maybe I don't remember the exact wording, but you do have to venerate images. And while I'm fine with a limited form of veneration, for instance, we do we do genuflections and we bow when we approach the altar. Those sorts
You
of
kiss
things.
do you guys kiss the cross in the Bible?
We kiss the Bible. We don't do the kissing of the crucifix at the end. I've seen some Orthodox do that. You're talking about the end of the liturgy?
Or yeah, in any context, do you guys kiss the cross at all? When you do the Stations of the Cross, do you kiss the cross?
No, not quite. There's one practice for Good Friday in which a life-size cross is brought up for some people, and sometimes that's venerated, but that's about it. That's about as far as it goes. And some people will kiss and kneel before it and things like that. But there is a spectrum within Anglicanism on veneration of icons.
And I'm happy you bring that up because veneration is culturally conditioned. So veneration looks different in different cultures. Mm-hmm. And I think that includes, for example, like in my wife's culture, they don't actually kiss, right? They sniff cheeks. It's a thing in Southeast Asia. You can look it up. So the point is, how do you now? Like other polls, like not the Southeast Asian girls I've dated. They're in Australia. they do things different.
Implying I've dated anyone.
So that being said, it's now orthodoxies in Cambodia now. It's pretty much how I end every show is talking about it. How do we now teach Cambodian converts to orthodoxy to venerate the icons? And the reality is, what we do teach them is an alien veneration practice, right? Because they don't even kiss people, but now they're kissing pictures. So I think a lot of confusion over icons had to do with, even between West and East, the difference in custom and how to show veneration. So I think that's an interesting point you bring up. I'm not going to solve it, but I do think it's interesting. And yeah, I think probably sniffing icons is not a good idea. These are just the real world problems that evangelists run into, right? How do we evangelize this people? And the way they operate is just so different. It's a very interesting question. So I'm not going to, Sebastian, don't say that. Come on. So Father James, I am appreciative of your view there. I'm going to go to the next point, which was the kind of...
Can I super quickly, before you do that? Really
20 seconds, go.
All right, great. So the quote from Theodosius, the Bishop of Amorian at Nicaea II, he is making his confession to the council. This is where he says, to those who do not venerate the sacred images, anathema. To those who blaspheme against honorable and sacred images, anathema, so on and so forth. To those who do not diligently teach the whole Christ-loving people to venerate holy and sacred honorable images of all the saints who have been pleasing to God from the beginning of time, anathema. And done. That was the other bit. Basically, the other bit in his confession where he says, to those who have any doubts about venerating images, anathema. And Tarasius, the bishop, the president over the whole council, says that... hang on, I missed the bit. Okay, don't worry, I've got the wrong bit. Keep going. It makes the point.
So the point is, you better do it or else, right? Yeah. But maybe the other Paul, I could help you with this, and I'm gonna, because Jimmy Akin and Trent Horn got you covered. Anathema actually, right? All right. Actually, is no big deal.
Actually, anathema is a good thing. It's a good thing.
All right. It's no big deal. It's I'm anathema. I've been anathematized 3 times last Wednesday. I
mean, it cuts you out of the kingdom of heaven, but you'll still be in the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, you'll just
you still got the grace in your soul.
It's your anathemas will be like the Girl Scouts with the badges or whatever, right? You go, here's this and that, right? They're no big deal. And so we already know, like, that just doesn't sound right. But I want to now, like, more seriously interact where their argument is coming from, which still isn't right, but this is where I think intellectually the basis for it, right? They say it no longer applies in church law. All right, let's quote them. No longer applies to church law. I've seen Eric Ibarra in his monothelitism stream kind of make the same arguments of why Pope Honorius being anathematized, no big deal, because we've now know better. We've developed the notion that we don't anathematize people anymore. So let's just for a second, out of charity to Roman Catholics, presume that that's correct, and their epistemology is correct, and so they could correct themselves and go, yeah, that ecumenical council was really wrong, and everyone's wrong when they anathematize people. And so we could see that the idea then is, because they were wrong to begin with, it kind of invalidates that whole section of the council. It pretty much just cancels it. So you developed an epistemology that cancels something in a council or in the fathers or in both or in the scriptures, for that matter, that otherwise is inconvenient to you. And the Orthodox don't approach councils or epistemology in this way. The Orthodox have an epistemology of consensus, and if everyone agreed this is anathema, then it is, and it's not good. And the anathemas mean you go to hell. I mean, let's not mince meat about it. That's what the anathemas mean. And so, like, people came to me and they're saying, how are you going to respond to Joshua Shupin that there's these ritual cursing of the people that don't venerate icons? And I said, by saying he's correct, right? And that he's taking issue with something we actually do, and we shouldn't be embarrassed of it. And if you are, it's because you don't believe what we're doing. And if you can't get down what we're doing, then you're not amongst us, right? So it's not something that we should be running from, in my view. Again, that's the Orthodox approach to this. The Roman Catholic approach to this seems to me much more modernist. And so, again, that doesn't make it wrong. It just means how they approach it is very different. And so the other, Paul, because you were kind of cut off with your other thing, I'm going to give the opportunity to respond to anathema actually.
Yeah, that's right. So from whatever the Roman epistemology is, the fact is, in the mind of the council itself, from the letter of I believe it's the letter of Tarasius, Bishop of Constantinople, and the president of the council to the emperors, and he himself defines anathema. He says the following in that letter: if anyone does not agree, if anyone does not agree but is disputatious and offended by the veneration of sacred images, he is anathematized by our holy and ecumenical council, fortified by the operation of the divine spirit and by the traditions of the church and the fathers. And an anathema is nothing other than separation from God. If there are any who are unpersuaded and quarrel with what has been decreed, they are kicking against the pricks and harming their own souls by taking offense at Christ, delighting in the calumnies against his church. They are detected waging an insane war against piety, so on and so forth. Point being, no unambiguous words in the mind. Again, whatever the Romanist epistemology is, whatever, we can grant that they can have their own Build-A-Bear church and theology where the Pope can just assemble things like Lego. The fact is, in the mind of the council itself, they believe that an anathema was damnation. It is nothing other than separation from...
That is a good meme. I ain't gonna lie.
I've got the perfect counter meme to that. But in my mind, it is a separation. It is literally says it is nothing other than separation from God. And those who defy the council, they are harming their own souls. So it's not merely, as Akin and Horn try to say it, it's not merely that it's separation from God in that you're being separated from the church and so you don't have access to the sacraments and you can't confess if you have mortal sin. No, it is an active agent. It is actually impugning on your soul to be anathematized by the council. And so, again, even if we grant the internal consistency of their epistemology, this should just tell people from, I reckon, a basic intuitive and historical, methodological minded sense. In what way can they claim consistency with and claim the infallibility and ultimate authority of such councils and total consistency with them when a key definition on something pertaining to the damnation of souls itself, they have just decided to change it? What happened to people after Nicaea II and before Rome's changes on that issue that were anathematized? Were they on the way to hell, but then as soon as 1960s comes, yoink, it's okay now?
I mean, maybe, right? Because in all seriousness, whatever's bound in earth is bound in heaven. So, right, like, did that get on? Like, does that mean nothing now? These people,
yeah,
like,
or as I was going to say, was there a total disjunct between what was bound on earth? Like, was it bound on earth that they were going to be consigned to hell? But in heaven, actually, it's actually not different. As long as they didn't commit a mortal sin, they're actually okay. What are they trying to propose here? What happened? Where's the consistency?
Well, consistency is overrated. So that being said,
here's a solution.
What's the solution? Oh, the tape. Slap some Newman on it,
Slap some
man.
Newman on it.
We're gonna get to there. We're gonna get there. We're gonna get some more. So we have John Colarafi saying, according to Saint Nicephorus, Judaism was an origin for iconoclasm, which is interesting because actually during the iconoclastic period, Judaism did actually grow more anti-images, but before then they weren't. So it's an interesting debate to be had historically. That being said, I found this point interesting, and it's about the Baptists, all right? Like you like to say, the other Paul. Where they made the point that the Baptists don't follow the fathers on a ton of stuff, and I guess their point was that means Dr. Gavin Ortlund shouldn't really even pay mind to what the fathers are teaching and whether there's flaws or not. Could someone steel man that? I don't want to kind of misportray what Jimmy Akin and what Trent Horn were saying, but they're saying, like, why does he even care? They don't even hold to the fathers, and they get all sorts of things wrong. And that just sums up, all right, that's kind of like saying, oh yeah, we Roman Catholics got the icons wrong, but you Baptists are more messed up with the fathers and more stuff. But the issue is, Gavin Ortlund could say, but we're sola scriptura, right? You know, it's like, it doesn't matter if we disagree with the fathers. I personally, and I have a critique video on this where I think Dr. Ortlund doesn't really do a good job actually expounding that, but someone like Dr. James White would just hit that ball out of the ballpark. He would just say, like, yeah, they're wrong. You know, right? And that is a legitimate argument that could be had. We can make historical arguments. We can make even philosophical arguments where that could be problematic. But the point is, if you don't accept that the fathers are an authority, then it doesn't matter if you're Baptist, honestly. It doesn't matter if you're Jehovah's Witness or Mormon, for that matter, right? If we're going to go by just foreign epistemologies. So the point is, it really would need to address, and I think Akin did a better job. Akin was channeling his other Paul debate, honestly, where it's like, well, without presupposing sola scriptura, this critique wouldn't make sense. And fair enough. But I also think that doesn't mean Dr. Gavin Ortlund all of a sudden loses his brain and the capacity to be critical of history, right? So, like, even if that's not how he does theology, even if that's not how he gets down with worship, that doesn't mean he can't now critique you because you do have an historical faith and something else allegedly doesn't align with history. And I just think that Dr. Ortlund's done very well in this point, and I think the defense is in conceding the grounds of history to him by saying, well, you have no right to even care about historicity. Well, yes, he does. I mean, an atheist can if they want to. So that's really not the point, you know. And I'll just say one last point. It kind of reminds me of how Eric Ibarra replied to Dr. Ortlund on the issue of the Assumption of Mary by saying it wouldn't matter if there was no historical source until the 11th century on the Assumption, because that's not how we do theology. And it's sort of like, well, actually, it should matter, because if it's not historically the case, then your doctrine's based on a lie. Then what are your doctrines based upon? And it becomes like almost ultramontanism. It's just the infallibility of a pope, what has been, prophetically revealed by a pope almost. And literally, by the way, if you read their Eighth Ecumenical Council, where they actually state that. But why can't the Protestants say, we cut around a lot of jargon if we simply just say the scripture is the only thing that are infallible? It's actually the one thing we all agree upon is that the scriptures are breathed by God. You would think that they have no issues and they're correct, right? Why do we need to postulate these other things that have to wait 1,000 years for something to make it infallible? So I think it's just not a very convincing point from Trent Horn and Jimmy Akin. River, the floor is yours. How about you take some time to respond to that?
Yeah, I think what they don't really get is how Protestants will chiefly use fathers. So for us, because only scripture is infallible in the inspired word of God, fathers don't have absolute authority in and of themselves. So just because a father held in high regard says something doesn't mean that's automatically true or anything like that. What the fathers do, the main value of them is giving us an indication about the apostolic deposit of faith. So, for instance, if all of the earliest fathers are Trinitarians, that gives us a very good idea that the apostolic deposit is Trinitarian, right? like that's just simple logic, because it's like, oh, well, these fathers are Trinitarian. They've inherited something from the apostles. Obviously, that's what they've inherited. So I believe in infant baptism. And Gavin Ortland, unfortunately, does not, which is a serious issue. But the reason why it wouldn't be an issue for him about the fact that the fathers, basically, as far as we can tell, believe in infant baptism, is that he can just say, well, yeah, because we don't see infant baptism be explicitly taught in the first in the second century or that sort of thing. Once we start to see it happen, yeah, the fathers could have just gotten that wrong by that point. But his point about images is that if we see the earliest occasions when fathers talk about images, it's negative, and it's a very long time before they start teaching it positively. That gives us a very good indication that the apostles did not hand down the veneration of images. So essentially, all we're trying to do is we're trying to use the fathers to figure out what was inherited in the generation after the apostles. And you can use arguments to say some things the fathers got were wrong. So, for instance, I have to admit that the fathers, by and large, do not believe in sola fide, right? As far as we can tell. Like, I mean, some Protestants might not like me saying that, but it's just sort of like, they're not, it's not the thing.
Thank you, River. People are cutting a video of this as we speak.
Yeah. And we can just say, yeah, they got that wrong, and we can make arguments about why we think they got that wrong. But we can also make arguments about how, if they're all anti-images, that seems like it's from the apostles. And the fact, and this just shows how Trent and Jimmy just aren't seeing this in the right way, which I think that we can actually agree on, me as a filthy Prot and you as a idolatrous Orthodox, is that
at least I'm clean.
What we're trying to do is we're trying to believe and practice the faith of the apostles. That's what matters. And I think they have this sort of silly view of you can believe something even if you do some mental gymnastics to logically work your way out about, oh, this might be the implication of what the apostles taught through various means. That's not what we're trying to do.
I hate to cut you off. We're 42 minutes, and we're only in 0.6, and we have like another 20. So we're gonna push forward, and we're gonna talk about infallibility soup. And what's that? In short, I can't quite get a finger on what they think is infallible. They had like a lot of these categorizations over like what's infallible and what in a council is binding, what's not. And ultimately speaking, I have pretty much a whole article and show on Anastasia Liberian where we go over the epistemology, infallibility, and how it historically changed in the 9th century in the Latin West. So this is not something that we can't identify, actually. We know when and how it changed. But I just want to speak for all practical purposes, which is if we're turning the council to a wax nose where we could just start disregarding what in its binding, what's not, how is this any different than like the liberal approach to scriptures where, we don't like complementarianism. We don't like what scriptures say about this or that social issue, which is not popular anymore. And it's the same sort of liberal approach to ignoring the apostolic deposit of faith and twisting the apostolic deposit of faith. Again, as an Orthodox Christian, we would view the councils as a consensus of the church preserving what the church has always believed, perhaps clarifying it with new language, but preserving what the church has always believed. So to take what the church has always believed and say, no, we can start cutting stuff out, it's really no different how the liberals approach the Bible. That's how it comes across to me. Father James, how's it come across to you? Well, you're on mute, Father James.
I make fun of you for doing it, and then I do it myself. That's what I get for
there you go.
I was mocking you in my heart. I apologize. Please.
And what's with your liberal collar? It's white all around.
This is not liberal. This is historic.
And it's liberal in my book. It should be mostly black. All right.
Yeah, no. You had a full white collar, Craig. Come on, man.
I do need to. Okay, I need to explain this. The whole part where only this part is revealed and this part is all not revealed. That is a more informal shirt, clergy shirt. This is the actual formal one, and what you do is you wear your cassock over it, and that's what creates the the part that's uncovered. That's how it's supposed to be. So this is actually the historic way.
All right. So infallibility, Father.
Okay, sorry. So it comes. This is happening, especially in this sort of day and age, post Vatican II, precisely because of the liberal trend of the Roman communion. And I think the biggest, most obvious example of this, aside from sort of all the variety of ecumenical dialogues and more than dialogues, praying together, celebrating, not quite celebrating together, maybe, but praying together and all these other things. The big one to me that's just so obvious is their 180 on capital punishment, to where it was initially a good and right thing, capital punishment, and now it is evil. And just the arguments that I've listened to literally hours of Roman Catholics talking about it, defending it, arguing against it. I've read up on it a lot. It is just the arguments for them are really bad. I'm sorry, but if you look, especially during the time of the Reformation, they were defending the killing of heretics. And like, if that's their belief, that's their belief. Like, okay, just don't let me go in your country. But like, then to act like, oh no, we haven't changed our theology at all, even though we've sort of dogmatically stated these things, and now we're dogmatically stating that actually capital punishment is bad. Like, I'm sorry, this is just liberalism. It is liberalism, and they're going to do the same thing eventually.
But again, it's liberalism gets thrown as a pejorative. It's not by default bad, but we have to identify what is the spirit behind the argument and the way of thinking. Liberal. I would say liberal theology when it comes to a renovation of the theology rather than sticking to what the fathers have given us in scriptural. Well said.
And capital punishment is commanded by God in Genesis 9, and it's a binding universal commandment.
Amen.
Same
well,
as
there you
not
go.
eating blood, by the way.
And also, Christ said, you've heard eye for an eye, tooth for the tooth, but I say so. Again. I leave it to the government to decide to stop capital punishment, and it's neither good nor bad, but mercy is never bad. So anyway, that being said, someone says, here's an easy one, Craig. You don't agree with many fathers on geocentrism, and the critique that's being made here is that if you believe in consensus and infallibility through consensus, that means that you're wed to alleged geocentrism in the fathers, or let's say creationism and no evolution, if that's your thing, etc., etc. This is not a video about those things, so I'm not taking a stance on them. But I just want to make clear so people don't get confused when they read the fathers. They make historical and scientific errors a lot, as well as philosophical errors, because some philosophy and science was very much tied into each other in those days. They were secular disciplines, and so we don't deny that the fathers can make errors in secular disciplines. Our concern has to do with them making errors or not in supposedly preserving the apostolic faith and their teaching function in the church, teaching the apostolic faith. And so that's the issue. I know obviously my Protestant panel will say the Orthodox have fallen short on that, and so that's not for debate right now. But I only say this because stuff will be coming out, and I've already done on, let's say, the issue of the rebaptism controversy in the 3rd century. And my view is that St. Augustine, St. Jerome, St. Vincent de Lérins, that they would preserve a proper canonical view of the Orthodox Church pertaining to baptism, but their history is all wrong. And people seem not to be able to compartmentalize those things. So wait, someone could have correct doctrine but bad history. Yes, I'm going to say that's the case. And in fact, if people give me time, I could unpack that case. But I just wanted to address that so people don't have the wrong view of infallibility. Now, infallibility soup, we served that bowl. Let's now talk about this, which I heard during the video, which is icons are only honored, and honor is not that big a deal. This is my words, trying to understand what they're saying. And it borders on educational, and Gavin's okay with that, right? And so they're sort of pretty much walking back what veneration is. And I just want to say, okay, will you pray to the icon? Will you kiss the icon? Do you really think the Satan sees you through the icon? That's where the rubber meets the road. And so I'll just leave my comments there. Other Paul, how about you give some of yours?
Yeah, this is a very consistent slippery tactic throughout the video where they try to equivocate between veneration as formally understood by the Second Council of Nicaea, by Rome in the East, in those contexts, versus much more menial acts which simply can't be compared. Like, for example, Akin will end up calling the event when they constructed the bronze serpent, and that they said, if you simply gaze upon the serpent, you'll be healed. He ends up saying this is a religious act towards an image, therefore veneration. And I'm sorry, that's just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. The call to gaze upon the serpent is qualitatively incomparable to offering deliberate acts of honor and veneration, whether it's bowing or kissing, because it's never said that this is an act of veneration towards the image. And yes, that is the belief, that it is that icon veneration is venerating the image, but that veneration then passes through the image to the prototype. That's the important thing. It's not just from the person direct to the prototype, but it is something directed to the image, through the image, to the prototype. It's never said that this act of gazing upon the bronze serpent is a veneration of the serpent. I don't think how you can justify that at all. It is literally just saying to look upon the serpent and you will be healed. So that example and other things where they'll equivocate veneration proper with, setting up images in someone's honor, that's veneration of image. No, it's not. The actual act of making the image itself in someone's honor, whether it's like a statue of Christ outside of a church or a statue of John Calvin or whatever, those can be said to be something done in honor of that person. That's not the same thing as then going up to the image and directing honor to it directly. It's their acts of equivocation on that is just completely silly. I'm gonna be frank. I have a hard time thinking even they don't see the difference, but they really just want to try and squeeze out any number of any instance they can of just causing such uncertainty and muddying the waters, so as to cause whether Dr. Ortland himself or people who are influenced by him, cause them to really try to question, like, am I really being consistent? So if I'm okay with making an image at all, if I'm okay with having this icon right here of Christ with the Lord's Prayer on it, if I'm okay with having that, therefore I must be that's veneration. Therefore I must be okay with doing anything that they call veneration.
Yeah, it's as I referred to before, it's veneration. The way it looks outwardly is culturally conditioned, right? Even in the West, if you I don't know, people know this because they just follow these apologetic arguments. They don't look at the real world. Roman Catholics tend not to kiss religious imagery, not like the Orthodox. The Orthodox are very much more outward and showy with how they treat images. It's cultural and it's imposed if you convert, that you partake in this Jewish and Hellenistic practice of how they treat objects. But that being said, that's not, the outward showing is not iconodulia as much as what the intent is behind it, what that could be proved to be, and what it's thought it accomplishes, right? As you said, if there's a type-prototype distinction, that it's an actual conduit to the saint or to God. This is what iconodulia really is. And so just thinking an image is educational, like St. Gregory the Great says, it's not necessarily a contradiction of iconodulia, but it isn't iconodulia, right? Those are two different things. So I will leave that there, and we'll go to their talk about doctrinal development, which we already spoke about quite a bit, but the U-turn stuff. And I think you guys wanted me to play a clip on the U-turn stuff. So I'm going to share screen, and because sharing screen and dealing with technology live, it always makes for bad entertainment. So my apologies. But this should be queued up, and if there's an advertisement, my apologies again. So here we go. You should be hearing everything. I'm going to start.
Reversal, or a U-turn, which would invalidate the Catholic belief that the Holy Spirit guides ecumenical councils, even if not everything they teach is infallibly defined. Here's Jimmy's thoughts on that.
In his video, Gavin displays a surprisingly simplistic understanding of how doctrinal development works. He says that the veneration of icons can't be an example of doctrinal development because, in his words, it would be a U-turn, meaning a reversal of direction. However, Gavin does not appear to understand how doctrinal development works. One of its most common forms is purification. When this type of doctrinal development happens, the church looks at a particular subject and realizes that it contains different types of elements. Some of these elements are binding parts of the faith, but some are not. And so a purification occurs where the binding principles are retained and the non-binding elements are removed. Another common form of doctrinal development is extension, the extension of principles. When this happens, it's realized that principles that are a part of the faith can be applied in new ways, and a new synthesis or practice emerges.
Now, do I have to keep listening to this, other Paul, or am I okay?
No, because we need to get to the circumcision bit.
All right, I'll keep going.
Let
Let me just make a couple comments.
He doesn't agree with it.
Let me just make a couple comments for. I'm just going to say this, which is from the Orthodox perspective, what he's saying about these principles and whatnot, that's just the law of inference. So the idea is, well, this is logically consistent with what we did before. It doesn't matter if by practice it looks totally different and it's actually something we rejected. All that matters if it's logically consistent. And that's how Orthodox do theology. We have an experiential approach to doing theology. It's not just purely you speculating theology and you can literally come up with new doctrines because they're all logically consistent. That's not how we do theology historically in the Orthodox Church. That's the scholastic approach, and it's wrong, and it's not historical, and it's not what you find in the first millennium. So that's number one, this idea of the purifying that, like, right? So I'm guessing it was wrong that originally the church didn't venerate icons, and that got purified out. But somehow what they didn't do was logically consistent with what really is apostolic, and so now it's legitimate that it is. And I found it very dismissive to say, this is simplistic. No, it's not simplistic to look at something ridiculous and to say, this sounds ridiculous. That's not simplistic. It doesn't mean that their worldview isn't philosophically internally consistent. I never said that, right? I said that actually earlier, that the Numenian doctrinal development is eternally philosophically consistent. Whether or not it's a good epistemology to apply is a whole other matter. It's not simplistic to say, this just sounds ridiculous. I'm not down with that. Right? I'm not down with doing something that, let's say, the apostles would have found reprehensible because it's logically consistent, right? So I think there's something to be said about conscience not allowing that. So I'll continue playing because my Protestant panel is demanding it of me. So we'll continue.
As a result of these two phenomena, doctrinal development can result in some quite striking forms that can, in fact, be described as U-turns. For example, under the old law, if you wanted to be one of God's chosen people, you had to get circumcised. You had to keep kosher laws regarding what you could eat, so no pork for you. And you had to keep certain holy days, like the Saturday Sabbath and Yom Kippur. But we see doctrinal development taking the form of a U-turn in Scripture itself. In the New Testament era, it was realized that these elements of the Old Covenant contained valid principles, but Christ fulfilled the law, and so these things were no longer binding. They still represented spiritual principles that did apply, but now, to be a member of God's chosen people, you didn't have to be circumcised. You didn't have to keep kosher, and you didn't have to observe the Saturday Sabbath or Jewish holy days like Yom Kippur. Going from you have to be circumcised and keep the Jewish law to be a member of God's people to you don't have to be circumcised and keep the Jewish law to be a member of God's people is a doctrinal U-turn. So we can't say this looks like a doctrinal U-turn and that means it can't be doctrinal development. We see this type of doctrinal development in Scripture itself. So we have to be more careful and sophisticated and ask whether a given case accurately purifies and extends the principles involved. Do
I have to go further? Am I done?
Like the thing, circumcision was
okay. I have literally heard this argument with United Methodist friends of mine who are pro-gay quote marriage. I've heard.
Well, it's. Let me just say a couple things. One would be, we believe that the Holy Spirit guides the church into all truth. I think we all believe that. I think what the church is different. And so I don't think it would be wrong to say that the church over time discerns things that are more helpful spiritually. And so, for example, that may be, I don't know, certain prayer practices could become more popular, less popular. In Orthodoxy, we call these canonical norms. So, like, we think that there's certain canonical norms in iconography, and they're better, and you see it's proved out over time. And certain prayers get proved out over time. And so these aren't dogmatic changes. These are just changes in, I would say, how people discern through experience the most useful way, the best way of living out the Christian faith. And so that is not a U-turn if it's about, all right, we believe in iconodulia, but we think icons should look like this. Or we think we should pray, but prayer should sound like this, or should talk about these things. Or we believe we should fast, but we should fast on these days, or shouldn't fast on these days, right? This would not be an example of the church U-turning, but the idea that, let's say, baptism is necessary for salvation, as Jesus Christ teaches in John chapter 3, and for that not to be someday, that would be a U-turn that's just not possible. For iconodulia to be something that's necessary for salvation, but for it not to be true someday, or for it to not be true one day but be true the next, that's just not possible. That sort of U-turn just doesn't make any sense from what I could tell. I think it was Father James that spoke last time. Who's up next now? So, Other Paul, you want to respond to this? How about you respond to the whole U-turn issue?
Okay. Two things. One, I swear, almost deliberately, it seems like, I don't want to impugn motive, but it almost seems deliberate. It's so obvious what Dr. Ortland means by U-turn. He doesn't mean something that's just less clear and vague, not explicit, and then they're like, oh, let's consider this later on, and now we change our practice in light of things we otherwise always believed or we just weren't clear on. His argument is that there's a U-turn where they once believed not A, and now they believe A. So a U-turn as in a complete contradiction. That's his argument. They know that's his argument. They acknowledge that throughout the video, and yet Akin here is acting like, oh, well, he just means U-turn in some very simple, generic sense. Oh, but there are U-turns, blah, blah, blah. Oh, my word. Okay. In the sense of a flat contradiction, they all know, Akin knows, Horn knows, Craig knows, we all know that for Rome and the East, it is impossible, per their claims, for there to be a U-turn in the sense that Dr. Ortland is saying. And that's his whole argument, that there is an internal contradiction in their system where the fathers unanimously once believed not A, and now they believe A, with respect to like their institution. That's the claim. It is not what Akin is saying. Second of all, the example was absolutely amazing because unlike doctrinal development, this U-turn was divinely revealed. It's in divine, it is confirmed by divine revelation. It was revealed by God himself to the apostles. And even in this, it's not so much a development as it is a more explicit recognition of something already logically entailed, because the covenant laws were only specifically made to Israel itself. It was never given to the Gentiles, but because the covenant has been expanded to the Gentiles, some people ask the question, well, do they have to follow it? And one can both say that, A, the apostles simply recognized the logic of the scripture, where those laws only applied to the people of Israel itself. Therefore, it doesn't have to apply to the Gentiles. But even then, we don't have to go that route, because we know for a fact it was divinely revealed to them. It was divinely revealed to the apostles that not only that the Gentiles don't have to keep these kosher laws and ceremonies, even the Jews themselves don't have to. That was divinely revealed. And for us, it is divinely revealed because Holy Scripture is the very revelation of God. And so, yes, in terms of revelation, when God brings us from one period in salvation history to another, yes, he can do that U-turn because it's part of his plan in salvation history. But the claim of Rome and the East is that we don't do U-turns like that, because now this faith is the final form of the faith, the once for all delivered unto the saints, and that we are simply preserving that as it is. And if there's areas that are less clear, we study it and try to see what's the most consistent thing with that. We cannot do that U-turn anymore. That was a special act of divine revelation going from one period of salvation history to another. We are claiming to be in that same new covenant now. We cannot do U-turns like that. So Akin's example is utterly incomparable. You can't do a U-turn like that anymore. Maybe this is just the
No.
tacit admission that Rome is functionally giving
Now,
you...
Paul, because we got limited time and we can't keep going on. But I want to push back a little bit and say that God's not just arbitrary, where he just randomly changes rules. Where, all right, I'm just gonna make people circumcise themselves because that'd be funny to make them do, and now I'm gonna make them get wet because that'll be funny to make them do, and he just arbitrarily changes rules. We have to have a Christological view of these things that they get fulfilled. And so if there's something in the Old Testament and
rooted in divine revelation.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify this.
Yeah.
And so the U-turn is not a U-turn if it's actually we're just veering towards Christ and we hit Christ, right? That's the direction we're going in. And ironically, the whole Orthodox argument in favor of iconodulia that the Damascene makes, his scriptural argument, which I know you guys take issue with, but at least that's where he's coming from, right? That's the argument he's making. People can say it's ad hoc, and he contrived the scriptural argument to try to explain what is an aberrant historical practice that started centuries later. But the point is, that at least epistemically is his basis. It's not this U-turn epistemology, which just, again, is not orthodox, and it was not made by anyone during Nicaea II or any of the fathers, because it's just not how the church does theology. Now, I wanted to also bring this quick point up. Wouldn't the Protestant musical instruments be a U-turn? And I'd say at least arguably not, because we actually have scriptures that say praise God with the heart. I actually think the existence of musical instruments is easier to defend scripturally than the Orthodox absence of them. I would say I would actually lean myself upon the Orthodox tradition, right? The sacred tradition of Orthodox Church. And I think that's where, as an Orthodox Christian, sometimes you have to say, listen, there's a lot of things where I think biblically our case is easier to defend than what they think their case is. But the musical instrument thing is kind of hard because we actually have these positive admonishments in the scriptures that use musical instruments to praise God. Now, I'm not arguing in favor of musical instruments, and yes, I know the Greeks have organs and I want them to get rid of them. I'm just saying we have to have the humility to actually sometimes say, yeah, this is not something that would be crazy in the scriptures. In fact, our view would be harder in isolation to extrapolate from the scriptures. So that I just wanted to make that comment on musical instruments, and that'll have to be the last word so we can move on. I just have a couple notes about the altar argument. I was pleased to see them pick up on my origin argument about the existence of altars, because people aren't aware, but let's say in the homilies on the book of Joshua, Origen explicitly makes reference to pagans. He says that pagans sanctify their altars with the blood of animals, but we sanctify our altars with the blood of Jesus Christ. Right? So it's really ahistorical to say that Christians don't have altars, or when Origen said Christians don't have altars, they don't have images. It's not illegitimate to at least point out that, well, Christians really did have altars, so maybe the way you're interpreting that passage is wrong. However, this stream is not about necessarily defending that. That's an argument I made with Dr. Gavin Ortloon. It's an argument I will continue to make. But I do think it was at least worth bringing it up. I think it was good that they did. I think it's good that they brought up that Clement of Alexandria did believe in the existence of some imagery. My argument is it would be apotropaic imagery that he was defending. But I want to give the floor to River, and I'm going to say, please shoot to make your point in 60 seconds to 90 seconds. What's your response to their treatment of Origen and Clement?
I think I'll pass to someone else on that one, but I just want to quickly say that I just think that, just to reiterate what we said before, Jimmy's circumcision argument was so bad that it kind of discredited a lot of what he had to say from then on. I mean, circumcision is spiritually fulfilled. It's not gone away. We're spiritually circumcised through the Holy Spirit. Anyway, in terms of when it comes to the father stuff, I'll just pass on to someone who might have a bit more knowledge than me.
All right, so other Paul's volunteering. Other Paul, Origen.
Yeah, this Origen and almost all the other fathers I deal with, they have a very key methodological error, which is why I want to, within the spirit of Trent Horn's, how Protestants argue like atheists, I want to say how Romanists argue like apostates, because various people, in the same way that Horn and Akin argue, oh, well, they're not arguing against Christian images, just pagan images. Likewise, in the same vein, people who support homosexuality and try to excuse Paul's condemnations in Romans and First Corinthians, they try to say, well, Paul wasn't condemning all homosexual relations, just those in like cultic prostitution or domineering relationships, because those were the norm in antiquity. That's questionable. But even if we grant that, that's still not true, because the rationale, even if we grant that, the rationale that Paul uses to condemn those things, why they are wrong, is not because they're cultic or because they're domineering. It's because they're homosexual. Likewise with Origen and Clement and Augustine and Athenagoras and almost every single other father here. I grant that the cases of Irenaeus and Justin Martyr, they're not as clear. Likewise with the Council of Elvira, I think there are translational issues at play. But otherwise, with almost every one of the other fathers, they claim that, oh, well, they're not condemning Christian holy images, just pagan images. It doesn't follow, because they, contra what Akin and Trent Horn say, the pagan idea that gods physically possess those idols is not the only reason. In fact, it's not even the most common reason that these fathers give against images. A lot of their reasoning is because these images are corruptible and cannot reflect the glory of the invisible God, which they even those fathers who affirm Christ's deity, some of them will say that. Like with for example, the dialogue Octavius by that Marius dude, I forgot his name, I have it in my notes. Even it talks about how Jesus, even though it doesn't talk about the incarnation much, it talks about how Jesus is believed to be God, and yet throughout the whole thing, it still talks about God being invisible, and so he cannot be represented by images. And so they basically totally gloss over that rationale. And the argument is that those rationales, those very common patristic rationales, that images fail to represent the glory of the invisible God, that is something which I believe is totally violated by iconodulia. And the rationale of John of Damascus that the incarnation changes this is very much a later development. This is not something present in those sources. So it's not enough to simply say that in context they're responding to pagan images. The rationale those fathers give is something against images simpliciter with respect to God.
Now, like in kind of reference to the same, I actually kind of like they brought this up about Tertullian. Now, like, Tertullian's an extremist, and honestly, I think that is a good point. He was against all art whatsoever, and so I'll just bring it back to the other poll. How does that fit into this, like, how we treat some of these sources? How could we be careful, at least, to think of the individual and how that may shape what they're saying? Like, would you think Tertullian is really a good source to cite, or do you think that's kind of like a cope thing they were saying?
Well, I think it depends on what the source. It really depends on so many factors. One of them being, like, where is the source drawing its idea from? Is it purely giving it's their own opinion, or are they claiming to draw it from something past? Like with at least one of the Epiphanian letters, granting it's authentic for the sake of it, the Epiphanius in that letter, in one of the letters, claims, who in our fathers ever had images of Christ and all? And so he's actually drawing on his knowledge of the past practice of the church, whether he knows it through personal acquaintance or through past sources he knows of, which he is quite far read, so that is a significant witness.
30
or
seconds.
with Tertullian, we can see with Tertullian that it really is just him giving his opinion. That doesn't mean that that in itself doesn't mean that he was going against everyone else. He's just giving his opinion. And so the value of his witness would more or less just be with himself. And one could, in the absence of him opposing otherwise existing use of images in like liturgical utensils, if I'm not mistaken, if that was an absence, it would be evidence. It would be a good evidence of the lack of such practices and the existence of his view, at least amongst people. So it would count for something. How much, though, highly depends on many circumstances.
All right.
I think the strength of our case comes from compounding of witnesses.
So those many circumstances. I would add, I just say, when people read history, we got to not read history like modern Westerners. I know Australia's not in the West, but you're intellectually oriented like us, so I'm going to include you. And which is, we take things so literally, and we lack the nuance. Nuance is a word that's been ruined, and it should not be ruined. Here, case in point, both Eusebius and St. Epiphanius make the point that when have you heard ever of anyone venerating images or having images, right? Like, they both make the same point. St. Epiphanius makes that point in the same paragraph of saying that everyone's venerating images. So obviously it's a pious exaggeration. And And the Eusebius makes that point, but then Eusebius in Life of Constantine describes images in the new church that Constantine built in Jerusalem. He describes images in Constantinople that are put in place of the former pagan idols that were in Byzantium, which was the former name of the city. And so it's sort of like you have guys that talk about who's ever heard of images? They don't exist. And they're like, oh, by the way, they do exist. So it's like the point is, when we read sources, you have to look at not just what they say, but what they mean. Believe facts rather than words. So just a little bone I have to pick with history with people. Now I'm going to move on to the next topic. I'm just going to quote it. Theology of Nicaea did not exist in the 3rd century is the quote. Obviously, Orthodox would reject this. I've brought up what I believe are evidences of anti-Nicene iconodulia. Obviously, the panel here does not agree with it. But Father James, I'm going to pose you this question, which would be, if iconodulia didn't exist in the 3rd century, why should you have to believe it? You're on mute again, man.
Would you repeat it again?
If iconodulia didn't exist in the 3rd century, as Trent and Jimmy Akin are arguing, then why do you have to believe it?
Well, I don't think you have to believe it. Yeah.
but yeah, like they're saying, and why should he believe it if it didn't exist in the 3rd century? It just doesn't sound very convincing.
Yeah, and my issue is this: they don't really give a positive argument for their case. They give a lot of like, well, it doesn't, and that goes back to what I was talking about in the beginning, where it's sort of, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be understood this way. We could translate it a different way and all that sort of stuff. I got to peek over the comments. But I'm too short. That's why. No, but I'm sorry. It makes sense to an extent to sort of defend the position, but to sort of not give enough of a positive argument other than just sort of like, well, we're the church and we say so. Other than that bare assertion, I'm sorry, that's just not going to be convincing. That might be convincing for those who are already convinced of I was going to say in a more pejorative way, but those who are already convinced of Rome's claims, I'll say it that way. But I'm sorry, I don't find it convincing. It's all right, not good enough.
Father James, not good enough, not convincing. Let me ask this. I'm going to pose it to River unless he wants to pass the potato. Mm-hmm. They talk about that synod in Spain. I'm forgetting its name at the moment. No, the Hira is not in Spain.
Elvira.
Yeah. And they're saying, no, it's not a big deal because it's not an ecumenical council. And they merely didn't want the art to be desecrated. And I'll just make the comments briefly. Is this sort of ranking of councils like, well, if it's just a father, not a council, or if it's just a father, not a pope, then it's negotiable. And we Orthodox, we don't deal with the testimony of our saints, our canons. We don't deal with them in that sort of dismissive manner. And so it just comes across bizarre to me. I also felt the interpretation that they just didn't want the art to be desecrated is just kind of this, that's not actually an interpretation that the canon gives. So I can see why this wouldn't be convincing to someone that's more critical. So speaking of some more critical, River, do you have any comments you'd like to add?
Yeah. First of all, I agree with what you mean. This sort of ranking of councils, and the reason why Elvira or Elvira is important to bring up is it gives us an insight into the perspective of the church. And so if there is a council widely accepted that forbids images, that gives us an indication about what the church is doing. But in terms of this idea of what you asked to Father James, I think something to mention is how important it is in terms of the context of the liturgy. So we believe that the apostles did give us a liturgical form of worship. And as Anglicans, we take that very seriously. So Anglican liturgy is, we try and be very careful about making it traditional and in keeping with the early church's liturgy. And then many times Trent said that you can venerate images.
You got 20 seconds.
Liturgy. And of course, as Orthodox, you venerate images in the context of the divine liturgy. You can't add something to the liturgy, okay? So either venerating images was in the liturgy the apostles gave us, and that's part of the deposit of faith, or it's not. and you can't just add it in and now say you have to do it. And this is just a Roman Catholic issue, because at one time they said the Latin Mass is the liturgy and it's the only one you can do, and then they reversed that with their silly Novus Order. So they do obviously just have this bad habit of just changing things that they previously said, this is the faith of the apostles, this is the liturgy of the apostles, to now, oh no, don't worry about that. It's
called a U-turn. It's called a U-turn.
Yeah.
So and U-turns are okay, obviously. So how about they talked about the letter to Constantia, and they said how Eusebius shows honor by keeping an image in his home. And what he was allegedly worried about were images perhaps being misused or believing that divinities in them. And so let me just bring that up to you before we get into the whole forgery thing. Other Paul, what do you think of that coverage of Eusebius in 30 seconds?
Yeah, exact same problems as before. Impugning, trying to say that the reason of idols possessing gods is the only reason they refer to, when it's not. Eusebius is quite explicit from memory that the glory of the invisible God can't be kept, can't be, shall we say, portrayed in image and all that. Interesting that he nonetheless, like, probably does seem to feel uncomfortable with just destroying it, and so he just just keeps it out of sight for no one to do anything with it. No evidence that he's showing honor to it, quote unquote, other than the bare minimum. Look, I'm uncomfortable with destroying an image that is dedicated to Christ. I do the same. I am very vocally against iconodulia, and I would shudder even the thought of trying to wreck this image, even if it's for the sake of like people not worshiping it. I don't preclude that possibility for someone to do that rightly, but even I would be very uncomfortable with it, because in the end, the image still portrays meaning. It gives a message that is Jesus Christ. So even I would not want to do that at all. And so that doesn't show anything with veneration. It's another equivocation between a generic sense of honor by like not destroying an image or even making one in honor of a deity or a saint, versus actively giving devotional practice to.
Yeah. I'd like to add with Eusebius is like, because we know historically that he defended a statue made of Constantine where he's holding a cross. You know, Eusebius wasn't against portraits or portraiture, I think is the art history term for it. And so he wasn't against actual portraits. And we could see like in Irenaeus and St. Hippolytus, when they talk about the Caprocratians, or however you pronounce their name, reference is made to a counterfeit image of Christ. And it's because the allegation was that they claimed that Pontius Pilate had an actual real portrait of Christ made. And so like, right, it's like there's a real portrait and the ones they have are like these counterfeits that are copying it or whatever. And so there's this sort of difference that the fathers and other early church writers are able to differentiate between portraits and art for art's use and icons, which is for veneration's use. And so a good argument could be made that Eusebius would have had a more permissive view of art, but not for its religious use, particularly among the rabble. This is not something we can get in more detail now. This is not a response video or really on the issue of, let's say, where Ortlund's wrong or where other Paul's wrong or whoever else on Eusebius. But I think it's something people need to be aware of in the corpus of Eusebius anyway. But I found this interesting, and it's this saying, well, we just explained it away, but it doesn't matter because it's a forgery. And Epiphanius, it's a forgery. So, River Paul, what do you think? These forgeries? And so let's talk about that.
I don't think they're forgeries, but as I think Paul's mentioned before, so Trent has said that Protestants treat the fathers like atheists treat the Bible, and now he's doing the same thing. So if something makes them uncomfortable, it's a forgery. If you can't realistically claim something's a forgery, well, then it's only refuting the try and wriggle out of it. It's the whole video felt like that to me. It felt like how an atheist reads scripture really did. And it was so funny that it was Trent Horn making this argument, since he's been the one who famously said that Protestants read fathers like atheists do scripture.
Now, I'm sorry.
No, you go.
So there's this point where, say, images have divinities in them. And this was, just so people are aware, this is a big thing with pagan view of idol worship, is that they actually became, they would have indwelling in them the spirit of the divinity in some way. it's actually part of the reason that that Nicaea II actually rejects the blessing of icons. And this is something that's a bit of a debate in Orthodoxy right now, because there is in the Great Eucharistic since the 1700s, they now have prayers for the blessing of icons, for putting Holy Chrism on icons. And this was something that's been rejected in the Orthodox Church even up into the late 1600s. Dositheus of Jerusalem rejects the blessing of icons. The Saint Nicodemus the Hagurite rejects the blessing of icons. It's not a historical practice of the Orthodox Church. And the idea is because an icon doesn't have magical power because you have put it on the altar. I have icons behind me that have been on the altar, by the way. But they don't have magical power because you put them on the altar or you put chrism on them or they have special prayers. It's not that it is bad to do those things per se, but what gives them their power, and this is where I think when Trent Horn or Jimmy Akin want to kind of backtrack that we don't think the art has power. Yes, we do think the art has power. What gives it the power is that what it represents. It's the same reason why Jews think the mezuzah has power. And I think this is something where the apotropaic view of art and images and words is something that doesn't really exist so much in Protestantism, but exists across the board in the ancient world. It exists the pagans, it exists the Christians, it exists the Jews, and I'll just leave that there. So that being said,
Augustine, sorry, I might be wrong about this, but doesn't Augustine explicitly say that the pagans aren't so stupid to think that the idols or images are the actual God, and then that's why he uses an example as an argument to negate the veneration of images? I think some people.
He actually does. Yes, he does make that argument, and I cover this. It's if people want to read it, we actually read the source in detail. It's with it's called a defense of aniconism. It's with his name is Cal. I forget what my I have nicknames for the guests sometimes. I forget what his nickname was, but it's one of my first video on icons on this channel where we do cover that text. And yes, I would agree with you. I think there would be pagans that more spiritualize their practice, but to apply it across the board, I don't know if it's justifiable, because it does seem that does get parsed quite a bit in the rejection of images. So just because Augustine would say, well, there's pagans that don't view it this way, well, we have rejection of images where they are rejecting that idea. So
can I just say something I've been dying to say, and now's a good time to do it because of something Paul just said, which is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Roman Catholic Church actually doesn't follow Nicaea II anyway, since Nicaea II prohibits making images of the Holy Trinity. So you can't make images of the Spirit, and you can't make images of the Father. Jesus is the
sort of. There's a toleration of images of a dove. There is and also a statuary. Nicaea II shows attention on those issues.
I've been
but canonically, you're correct. Yes.
Yeah, I've been to Roman Catholic Church in India where there was a statue of an old man with a beard holding up Jesus, and then there's also a dove cuddling them. And honestly, that would be an image I would be happy to destroy. Paul said that he wouldn't destroy an image of Jesus. I would agree. I would destroy blasphemous images of the Holy Trinity because that is blasphemy. And
we're not going to take you to Holy Trinity Monastery in Jordanville, New York. That's for sure. Father James, he had something. Yeah. Could you add quickly?
Yeah, I don't think we actually did establish this firmly enough at the very beginning, but there are three positions. I somewhat within here. Well, no, two of them are here. One is the Eastern Orthodox Roman Catholic position of the appropriateness of veneration of icons. The second one, which is you're allowed to have icons. Icons are not a problem. You're allowed to have images of Jesus. You're allowed to have images of the saints, etc. But you are not to venerate them, or there's a limit to how that veneration works or whatever. And then there is just sort of this complete iconoclasm where images themselves are of Jesus, like a Muslim thing or a very hyper-Puritan thing. And what happens oftentimes, and it happens in this video, I think, of Trent Horn and Jimmy Akin, is that those last two are conflated, where a rejection of veneration, even to any particular extent, is the same as a rejection of any sort of images whatsoever. Not even like religious images, because they start going into like non-religious images and how like, to be consistent, you can't do non-religious images. I'm like, that's just ridiculous.
Now, unless we had a rigorous view of the second commandment, with like essentially that's what Islam has.
I know, but that's not what Gavin is saying or anyone else.
Tertullian is, but yes, I understand. So that being said, is with Nicaea II, do they condemn images of the Father? Just so people are aware, canonically, Nicaea II decrees that images be made of Christ and the saints and the angels, right? So that's what we're positively commanded to do. Those in the Russian Orthodox tradition have a canon from the Council of Moscow that it's absolutely forbidden to make icons of the Father. This is something that there is some debate over. I take the view that we cannot make icons of the Father, and recent Saint Umar Daniel Syzoyev shows consistency into the 21st century of the Orthodox on that view. But leaving that aside, because I know you guys don't like it, so there'd be no reason to talk about it some more. I wanted to mention something about Augustine, and if people have any other comments on Augustine, the issue of images, now would be the time. I'd just say that Augustine had a negative view of all art, and I want to point people to, because they mentioned about Augustine, they made a decent point, but Augustine rejected all art. You can see there's a book 10 of the Confessions, paragraphs 51 to 53. And the reason why Augustine did is it went against his ascetic discipline. He found this as a distraction of contemplating divine things. So I don't know if you guys want to add anything about that.
Yeah, I do. Yet another example, the same problems, trying to say, Augustine only opposes pagan images. And I believe Horn reads from, because this is from the key passage in question is exposition on Psalm 115. And Horn does read from that passages in order to contextualize them all. But it's really the same issue because it's not per se what the passage is saying, but what Augustine is saying about it and what he's saying overall. And he gives the very same reasoning wherein he says, but they seem to themselves to have a pure religion who say, I neither worship an idol nor a devil, but in bodily image I behold an emblem of that which I am bound to worship. They presume to reply that they worship not the bodies themselves, but the deities which preside over the government of them. So this is very common. You will see pagans like Celsus, like the hypothetical dude in the Octavius dialogue, like Porphyry, I believe. They'll routinely say, we're not, basically give the iconodulic defense. They're not worshipping the wood and stone, but the deity behind it. And Augustine, like multiple other fathers, doesn't care. He says, one sentence of the apostle therefore testifies to their punishment and condemnation, who, he says, have changed the truth of God into a lie and worshipped and served the creature more than the creator who is blessed forever. Whatchamacallit? And he goes on to say, but it will be said, we have very many instruments and vessels made of materials or metal of this description for the purpose of celebrating the sacraments, which being consecrated by these ministrations are called holy in honor of him who is thus worshipped for our salvation. And what indeed are these very instruments or vessels but the work of man's hands? But have they mouth, yet speak not? Have they eyes and see not? Do we pray unto them because through them we pray to God? This is the chief cause of this insane profanity, that the figure resembling the living person which induces men to worship has more influence in the minds of these miserable persons than the evident fact that it is not living, so that they ought to be despised by the living. And so Augustine's rationale is very explicitly contrary to iconodulic theology, wherein he says, he explicitly brings up the idea of praying through the image to God, and he completely denies that on account of the basic fact that the statue or the image itself is dead, not merely because the pagans believe it was possessed, but because the image itself is dead. Something which is true of all images of all kinds. And so, yes, whatever they say about Augustine, they can't save him. He is very explicitly in contradiction with.
I've got some other quotes from Augustine now. I'll just quickly read them. Those who have appointed images for the people have both taken away fear and added error. That is in City of God 4:9. And then one other quote from Augustine. He said, to fall completely into error was the due desert of man who sought for Christ and his apostles, not in the holy writings, but on painted walls. And that's in the Harmony of the Gospels 1:10-16. So, yeah.
Can anyone do either Jay Dyer or Ubi Petrus impression and simply just say, Augustine has all sorts of errors?
Yeah, well, Augustine he's wrong in everything. He rejects the essence, energies, distinctions. He believes in the filioque. He doesn't have the nous phronema of the East, so he's clearly wrong. He's technically a saint, but he's actually not a saint. He's a heretic.
All right,
He's on
so I don't think he would say Augustine's a heretic, but
No, he wouldn't say
but
that.
at least all right. So Jay's got us covered on our end, I suppose.
Speak
Now-
of the devil, Jay Dyer is actually on Tim Pool right now, which is interesting.
He is, yeah.
Yeah,
There you go.
I
So
didn't even
anyway.
realize that. Yeah.
All right, so guys, chill, go out of this stream and go somewhere else, right? So now, let me pose this to you, River. Gregory Nyssa, they cite that Gregory Nyssa speaks of Meletius, Saint Meletius, and how people look at the image and they pray to it and they receive intercession, and this contradicts the very surface level reading of Saint Epiphanius that icons didn't exist in his time. What's your response to that argument? Because I actually thought that was a legitimate argument they made.
Sorry, can you just say it one more time?
In short, St. Gregory Nyssa mentions images of St. Meletius of Antioch that people venerate and pray to. Obviously, that contradicts the idea that a correct reading of St. Epiphanius is that icons didn't exist in his day. Do you have any response to that?
Right. I think that it is pretty clear that there were icons in, I'd say even in the 4th century. We have images from catacombs and that sort of thing. They are there. I've never claimed that the fathers unanimously rejected images. My view is that as far as we can tell from the historical sources, there were fathers and there were dioceses and there were bishops who rejected them, and there were those who approved of them. And then the question is simply just who's correct, right? And so, for me, the reason why when I argue against images and against Nicaea II, why I always want to go back to Scripture, and why with the video that Paul and I did together, it was like 3 hours long on rejecting Nicaea II, we chose to stick with Scripture, is I think the fathers are just completely inconclusive on the issue, because you've got ones that you can use for it, like you mentioned of Gregory of Nyssa, and there's ones you can use against it, like St. Augustine. I think they actually just are all over the place. It's an issue where it's an area where the fathers did not agree with each other on it.
All right. So the next topic, I found this interesting.
If I may, super quickly.
No, you're not quick. So we're going on to the next one. So the textual critical rejection of Nicaea is disallowed because Hira had textual issues. And so, they were pretty much saying that Dr. Ortlund cannot be scrutinizing the textual issues with Nicaea II because he would have to then not affirm anything that Hira taught. And I just found it strange. Why couldn't he just out of principle say we've got issues textually in Nicaea II which call things into question? It was just kind of a bizarre argument. I don't know if you guys picked up on that. Apparently you didn't.
That again?
All right. So
Yeah, I caught that a little bit. I found that a little bit odd, especially coming from he is sola scriptura. He's not holding to any infallibility of any sort of council. So, yeah.
Okay, and I would also just add on that note that perhaps they were referring to maybe problems with the reception of Nicaea II, which are, it's right in the introduction from Father Richard Price. So I've brought up critique of that. But you can't fault a Protestant who's just taking a Roman Catholic scholar's word that there's these issues. So I think it's something to be said. It's a legitimate point. Doesn't mean make it true, but it's a legitimate point. And I think just saying, well, Hira has issues really isn't address the actual point. All right, stop pointing yourself, Other Paul. What do you want?
Oh no, I was just stroking my magnificent beard.
Other Paul wanted to say that he calls into question the interpretation of St. Gregory of Nyssa on that passage of St. Meletius. And so anyway, they were slicing and dicing St. Basil and the prototype type distinction. And I think the main issue is that I think Dr. Gavin Ortlund saying listen, Nicaea II is quoting it out of context. So if it's not really positively demonstrating what they're saying is demonstrating, that's problematic. I think that was Dr. Ortlund's point, and I think that's a fair point. Father James, do you have anything to add to that? No, you're on mute again, man. Good old Father James.
Yes. Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Mute. So does your mute turn off your speakers? So
No,
anyway,
I was looking up a verse. That I
that's
saw
how dare you read the Bible? No. So long story short, they're slicing and dicing St. Basil on the prototype type distinction, and they're pretty much trying to say, well, the distinction's correct. So even if Nicaea II applied the passage from St. Basil incorrectly, that doesn't make it illegitimate. But I do think that Dr. Gavin Ortlund's point is a fair one to say they were portraying the verse as being about icons, and it wasn't, and that's problematic. So I'm wondering if you have anything to add to that.
I have nothing to add to that because that's actually part that is just escaping my memory of the video. We're talking about between the two videos, like 5 hours. So sorry.
So there you go. That's okay. Escapes his memory.
I could add something briefly, which is just that, it just doesn't apply because, as from memory, right? Basil was saying that the worship to the Son passes to the Father since he's the image of the Father, right? That's what he was saying.
Yeah, but the way Nicaea II is portraying it was that it's actually about icons.
I know it's ridiculous. But the Father and the Son are one being. Of course, worshiping the Son is going to pass to the image to his Father.
Colossians chapter 1 says Christ is icon of the Father.
I know, but like a block of wood, okay, it's not the same being as Christ, and so no, it does not necessarily follow from Basil's principle that worshiping. Yeah. I mean, I there was a mistake. I'm not trying to be cheeky here. Yeah. Venerating a painted block of wood passes. And
so that's Rivers' opinion there. Now, they were making this point on Eucharistic adoration. The Orthodox don't have this practice of venerating the Eucharist. Father James, do the Anglicans venerate the Eucharist?
So there's a divide on how this sort of works. We tend to side with as my understanding of the Eastern Orthodox practice as well as the Lutheran one, in that the Blessed Sacrament's reason for being here is not for worship.
To be gawked at.
I mean, not to. When I say not for worship, in the sense of not to
be gawked at,
prostrating before and all that. Yeah.
Oh, well, so I'm cool with prostrating before it.
Well, no, and I'm saying I'm not that I'm opposed to prostration and so that.
But we're talking about the gawking at the sacrament.
Yeah, so monstrances and things like that. So for me, I would say like the point of the Blessed Sacrament, and this was kind of a weird argument for me when I heard them say it, because I do remember this one. I go, like, the point of the Blessed Sacrament is to receive it. So any allowance of gawking, as you say, just to begin with, is already problematic. So to use that as an argument when people are already a little bit sus about it outside of Rome, it's kind of odd.
I don't know how they figured out with StreamYard, but I'm happy they did. All right, so next topic. I'm going to quote, I forget it was Jimmy Akin or Trent Horn. It doesn't matter that an ancient writer never recognized the distinction. All that matters is that a real one. I'm pretty sure that's Jimmy Akin, actually. And so their point was, it doesn't matter if there is, no one talked about the type-prototype distinction. All that matters if it logically makes sense. And again, this is not how Orthodox approach theology. The concept has to exist for the distinction. If conceptually no one made a distinction, then it cannot be legitimate. So that'd be my take. Let me give it to the other Paul.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. This is ironically, it's so rich when they talk about Dr. Ortlund assuming sola scriptura when all he's assuming is that texts have meaning when they're written and you can deduce what they mean. And even saying how appealing to the fathers is assuming sola scriptura, like that's basic, because that was basically the whole of Dr. Ortlund's video. But this is really another case of, it's ironic because they jump into a Protestant mindset with this. Like, it doesn't matter if fathers didn't recognize it. It's the fact that it's there. Well, now you're assuming that you, the private individual, can discern a concept that's there that is not recognized by any of the fathers. Now, I'm cool with that. That's very based in.
I'm not cool with that.
I'm very cool with that. That's not cool in historic Roman or Orthodox thought. You're supposed to subject your conscience to the mind of the church and to the consensus of the father. And so if they do not recognize a concept, you can't suddenly say, oh, well, I can recognize that, and now my church can bind all the faith on that. That's completely backwards.
And people keep complaining that I can't pronounce Latin right, Akin right. Listen, man, we have screwed up K's, D's, T's near New York City. It's just how people talk, at least Italians. So what am I going to tell you? So on to the next thing. Oh, and just so people know, Latria Duli distinction, you could find in book 1 of On the Trinity by St. Augustine. He actually uses the Greek words. So he had to get that from the East. So these distinctions, I just think it's lazy when people give up, like, no, there's no distinction, but it could just all develop. It's just, we're not dealing with the sources, I think, properly when we're doing that. We already kind of talked about musical instruments, so we could skip that one. You guys cool with musical instruments?
Yeah, these Psalms say to praise God for the harp and tambourine, that sort of thing.
Guitar mass is apostolic.
Psalm
Peter
150.
Peter was jamming on the bass and calling people up for the altar call. It's facts.
Now, I do want to point out that among what's known as the regulative principle, Protestant reformers.
Thank you, Father James.
What?
So thank you. Well, no, yeah, the regular principle. Someone's got to talk about it.
Oh yeah. So the regulative principle is still practiced by some today, and
this quaint principle.
And I don't want to get into the details of it. I'm using the more colloquial term for it, just so people know what I'm talking about. There's a lot more nuance to it and everything. But yeah, a lot of the
we got to retake our nuance, by the way. We got to take our nuance from those who have taken it from us.
No, but they would actually deny instruments as well, and it's most specifically the Reformed type.
Yeah,
So
I always found that appeal to the regular principle very bizarre. I could see if someone said, "Listen, we only sing the Psalms, we don't sing hymns." Like, okay, I guess because there is a hymnal in the Bible, right? So that kind of makes some sort of sense. But sort of like, if you read those hymns, they talk about musical instruments. It's a kind of bizarre scriptural argument in isolation. It's not if you go, well, we have this whole way that we interpret the scriptures because no one ever used these things in New Testament times, as the Orthodox do. But interesting anyway. So, all right. They say that a Marian prayer is not idolatry. I'll just pose this to you. Could you concede that praying to a saint in some circumstance it could be useless, worthless, doesn't accomplish anything, but it's not by default idolatry? Or is the way you understand prayer is that prayer to anything other than God is idolatry? Let's go around the horn. Yes or no, Father James?
I find it in limited circumstances acceptable, so yes.
All right, so yes, sort of. River.
Dwight, is it just yes or no, or can I give a nuance?
Yeah, yes or no, and if you want to give nuance, it's got to be 10 words or less.
You can pray to saints and it not be idolatry.
Okay, but obviously you probably think it's not going to be work out well in most situations, I presume. All right, so good. And other Paul?
You're muted.
You're on mute, man. Father, you're channeling
Sorry.
your inner Father James.
Limited context of like a naive faith asking for a saint to pray and intercede for them. Not idolatry. Not correct, not efficacious.
So sort of like when little kids ask Santa Claus for stuff, right? They're
otherwise, prayers like, "Oh Mary, let it never be known that there was never a time when I fled under thine protection." Yeah, no, that's idolatry. See you later.
Yeah.
Now let me pose this back to River because it seemed like you wanted to say a little more, which would be, is this the difference between invocation, advocation? Is that something you wanted to address?
So the issue, look, obviously I can ask someone to pray for me, and that's not idolatry or something silly like that. The specific issue is, do the saints in heaven have the power to hear you ask their intercession? And if they do have that power, which I would argue you're basically going to have to say they're omniscient.
Yeah, the divine energies of God, they're pretty cool.
Right.
But
and
yeah,
I'm saying if you were saying they have omniscience, then you are dangerously close to idolatry. But also the
saints are God, though. It's theosis.
I have a lot of Roman Catholic relatives, and I've been to India for an extended period of time in a very Roman Catholic area. And can I just give you a little example here?
Sure.
In India, I was spending time in the slums of India on a mission trip. You have Hindus and Roman Catholics living on top of each other, just scattered around the slum. And every street, you'd have the same thing. On one side of the road would be a Hindu shrine to some stupid demonic god of like 10 breasts and stuff. And, they'd give money.
Not 11. Okay.
Right. And then on the other side of the road, every time there'd be a Roman Catholic saint with like a crown and all dressed ornately. And
it canceled it out.
And so I think for a lot of these people, it really is. It's just the same thing that the Hindus are doing, but with saints. And like you look at it, you think, yeah, that's idolatry. That's a very that kind
of.
Hey,
come to the mission trip in Cambodia. I'll show you my hood. Okay, I'll show you my hood. All right. So we have that. We were talking about Truth Unites becoming negative and polemical was one of. That's how they ended the video. So I'm going to play that clip and give you all an opportunity to respond to this before I give my response. And let's hope we don't get an advertisement. 1 second. That's the bronze serpent and it's closing thoughts, right, guys? I think so. All right, let's go. Oh no, an advertisement. All right, let's Mystery Science Theater it. What is this? Insightful travel trivia. You know what?
This is why I have.
Maybe
YouTube
we
Red.
should do that and not this show. The pyramids. How many? That's pretty sweet.
He did not.
All right, so are you guys ready for the clip? Good. All right, we're not disappointed we missed travel trivia. Let's go.
Not thoughtfully engage with the concept of idolatry and what the biblical writers were actually condemning. And he didn't consider how the biblical distinction between worship and veneration might be applied in a post-biblical monotheistic context. It's entirely natural that we don't have records of icon veneration in the early church. In the Greco-Roman world, idolatry was just as common as it was in the Old Testament period. And it took centuries before Christianity was so firmly rooted that people began to reconsider and apply the relevant principles. When they did, they realized
When's
that
he start
one
complaining,
can
guys?
perform religious acts with symbolic objects like the bronze serpent, as long as one doesn't consider
Let's
the
see.
object a god. And they realized that it is natural to
Watch
show
this, guys.
respect to images of people who deserve respect. They realize that you can show respect to images as a way of showing respect to the person that they represent. As Basil the Great said, the respect paid to an image of a king passes on to the king himself. You're really respecting the king by showing respect to his image. So this was indeed a case of doctrinal development in which solid biblical principles were
course,
applied in a new
doctrinal
situation. As far as Gavin's hyperbolic, this one thing will make you Protestant claim, no, it won't. His argument is based on an assumption of sola scriptura, and so it is just circular reasoning. He's assuming Protestantism in order to prove Protestantism.
Oh, other Paul,
When
he
you
just
actually
got you.
consider the biblical principles involved, you discover that making respectful gestures with respect to a symbol is just not idolatry. And the principle of being respectful to symbols of Jesus and other religious figures is something even Protestants themselves do. They just can't acknowledge the legitimacy of this in a Catholic or Orthodox context because of their tradition. Finally, I have to say that I've become progressively disappointed with Gavin's
All right.
channel, and I was
Ready for the progressive disappointment?
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
I've been building up to it. Let's go.
Wait, real quick. just real
disappointed
quick.
with this video.
Wait.
in
There's
particular.
something quick here.
For-
All right, how quick?
Yeah. Just he said a lot of that in the past few minutes that we just watched speed by. Just
Yeah.
watch the whole video that we just did. We talked about most of that already. So yeah.
There you go. So, yes, Paul.
Particularly because we didn't cover scripture much this video. C Minor Rivers 2 streams on scripture and Nicaea II. Their whole thing about
Linked in the
just
info bar is for more Prot nonsense. You could go to their channel. So very
That's
good.
it. Become Protestant. But yeah,
There you go. So let's go back and get into their final dig and audience questions. If you have questions, ask it now because this will be our last topic. All right. So ask your questions. If you got questions, we got 4 Protestant experts or 3, or I'm losing count. Let's go.
For a channel called Truth Unites, you'd think that it would focus more on the uniting part, on presenting a positive case for Christianity with which a broad swath of people could agree. I used to like this channel a lot, and even when I disagreed with Gavin, I appreciated the work he was doing. It was a positive channel. But it's gotten into a rut, and it's become progressively more negative. Instead of presenting the Christian faith in a positive way that is primarily appreciative of the contributions made by various groups of Christians, Gavin has become focused primarily on complaining about Catholicism and Orthodoxy with a corresponding justification of Protestantism. It's understandable that this would be a part of what the channel does. There's nothing wrong with apologetics. Everyone advocates his own view, and since Gavin's a Protestant, that would be expected. But this has begun to consume the Truth Unites channel, and it risks becoming just another channel of Protestant polemics. At the time of writing, 10 of Gavin's last 12 videos have been devoted to complaining about Catholicism and Orthodoxy and justifying Protestantism. Here is a screenshot that I took while I was writing this, so you can see the recent trend on the channel. Gavin's running the risk of this just becoming a Protestant self-justification channel rather than one about truth uniting people. And I'd hate to see it degenerate into a channel that's just primarily about critiquing other Christians.
And when it comes to my perspective, I want to say that I do appreciate Gavin's work, especially the work he offers as a Protestant apologist. I know sometimes in the past he has been uncomfortable, like he's maybe a reluctant Protestant apologist is not necessarily what he sought out, but many people look to him as carrying that mantle. And I appreciate it because his work is much better researched than other Protestant apologists and is presented in a much more irenic form. Now, and I have agreements with it, and I also have fundamental disagreements. So I would just encourage Gavin. I like that he continues to produce this kind of work, but I do think he may have to come to grips with the fact, is he a Protestant apologist or not? Is his channel devoted to a kind of ecumenism between Christians, or does he want to focus on providing a robust defense of Protestantism? And maybe Gavin will say he can do both. That's fine. But yeah, I still appreciate that, at least as an opportunity to provide a lot of clarifications and engage more of this substantive research. I'm really looking forward to the debate I'm going to have with him next month on Pints with Aquinas when it comes to Sola Scriptura. And hopefully he and I can have other nice back and forths and dialogues about the subjects we've engaged each other in these kind of rebuttal videos. So thank you guys for watching. And yeah, I hope that you all have a very blessed day.
Well, that's very nice of Gavin. So let me go around the horn to get everyone's opinion. Father James, you first. What do you think of that? Do you think it's getting more negative?
No, I mean, not on our side. So I find this so frustrating. I encounter this a lot myself whenever I do videos on Rome or some other topic. Well, specifically with Rome, with the papacy or things like that, where I get a lot of Roman Catholics who come on my channel and start complaining about the fact, oh, why are you doing a video, trying to refute us, an anti-Catholic video and all that sort of stuff. And it gets so annoying. I'm sorry. I'm not being a jerk. I'm being very nice. I'm being that matter of fact. I'm not playing games. Like, this is part of what we do. Like when we do videos, we're going to explain our theology, defend it. And there are many Roman Catholic channels out there making arguments against Protestantism or Eastern Orthodoxy or whatever. And I'm sorry, but especially when it comes to Protestantism, and you talk to knowledgeable Roman Catholics about this, they will say that things like Catholic Answers and others like that give a horrible misrepresentation of Protestantism. So we are trying to defend ourselves against those sorts of horrible misrepresentations of church history, or like, okay, I'll give one example, and I'm going to give a name if that's all right. One I'm very, very upset about, and Paul and I have talked about doing a video on this. Doug Beaumont literally argued that all Protestants reject the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. I confronted him about this.
This is Dr. Doug Beaumont, by the way.
Yes, Dr. Doug Beaumont.
Under Norman Geisler.
He was, yes, he was an evangelical who became Roman Catholic. So then he starts arguing, like, when I'm emailing him saying, that's just a lie. That's just not true. And I don't believe that you didn't know that. He goes, oh, no, it is true because, when I say real presence, what I mean is transubstantiation. I'm like, no, that you don't get to play that game. We as Anglicans literally came up with the term real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Like, you don't get to, as an explanation of our position. You don't get to take that term and then like redefine it into whatever you want it to mean and then misrepresent us that way. And that's just one of many. All Protestants reject infant baptism. All Protestants reject baptism from regeneration. All Protestants reject liturgy. All that sort of stuff. It's just so ridiculous. I hate it.
All right, we got the hate list, Father James. All right, so the Paul, getting more negative at Truth Unites?
I'd say so what? So bloody what? This,
because you're Australian.
I think Horn is still wrong in it, but he put it in a much more careful and qualified and positive way. He was better with that, but even then he's still wrong. But Akin, oh my word, that was a very overt, passive-aggressive, hey, you're not allowed to defend yourself. We can run roughshod over your tradition all we bloody want, but you're not allowed to respond. When you make videos defending your position, even giving a positive case at times, and when 12 billion Catholic apologists, whether it's William Albrecht, Keith Little, Trent Horn, Jimmy Akin, when they all start dumping their critiques,
I wouldn't conclude the first one in that list. But
they can dogpile him all he wants. That just simply shows how this is big apologetics here with Roman X, big apologetics. When they do that, and then suddenly Ortland feels, hey, you know what? I need to be more explicit with defending myself and defending my position. If he chooses to change that orientation, that's perfectly within his right, because he is being dogpiled quite a lot, and I'm not even opposing the dogpiling itself in principle, okay? But then to suddenly go around and say, hey, you were originally about Truth Unites, you're doing more positive stuff, which he does, by the way. He's done a lot of positive videos since his Nicaea II, since his Icon Veneration video, and before their release of their critique here. So that's utter bull. But even if he was, guess what? It's justified, because people are coming out from him left, right, and center, because very rightly they perceive him as a threat to their beliefs. He is very influential with a lot of people, and if they want to respond in that way, that's fair enough. That's their beliefs. They want to defend themselves. That's fine. I'm consistent that way. But to go out and start saying that Ortland, hey, Ortland, stop defending yourself, mate. Let us run roughshod over everything you believe. Let us attack you. Let us critique every video you make. Sorry, that is horse crap. Horse crap. Shut your dumb ass.
All right, well, we can repeat that one more time, but I don't know if that make more of your point. All right, River.
Yeah.
What do you think? Do you think that it's getting more negative there? The Truth Unites?
Well, yeah, I mean, he is doing some more, some content that's more defensive of Protestantism and critiquing other traditions. I would say, as someone who has my own channel, probably the thing that annoys me the most is when people think they have the right to tell me what to do with my channel. Like, no one has the right to say, oh, dude, you can't be doing, like, it's his channel. He can do what he wants. But I think the language was quite telling. Like Jimmy says that Gavin is doing a lot of stuff complaining about Roman Catholicism.
Protestant justification.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you, mate?
And another thing is just that when we want to explain what we believe, it's very important to also explain what we don't believe. And this is why, obviously, early church heresies ended up being something that helped us out, because we can now say, oh, we don't believe this, we don't believe this, we don't believe this. And so it is important for channels and for Gavin to make videos saying, I don't believe this, I critique the traditions that do this, this is why, but don't call that a complaint, like he's complaining against you, almost like they took it personally. I thought that was a bit childish.
Paul was way too divisive and negative in Galatians. He's just way too much.
Yeah. Hey, Craig, I'm sorry for the last naughty word there. That genuinely riled me up.
Paul's not happy. Paul's not happy.
Well, anyhow, my view is I think they're happening something correctly, rightly or wrongly. There's been a change of tone. It's something that Dr. Ortland's even said. I remember him last year saying, I'm going to increase the apologetics up a tick and, change a few things there. So there's been a conscious decision to make Truth Unites more polemical. And I think the frustration from the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox that follow the channel is it's image, right? So, like, no one's going to get mad at Jay Dyer if Jay Dyer is, cursing people out and calling people idiots and calling people fat, because that's what Jay Dyer does, right? So it's not like that's going to surprise people. We can say, well, I don't think he should do such things, but they wouldn't say, but that's not the Jay Dyer I grew in the love, it's just, that's what it always was. And so I think with Truth Unites, there's this sort of image where it's allegedly ecumenical, it's allegedly irenic, it's allegedly charitable, and the reality is that I think that Dr. Ortland does have an agenda. His agenda is that there's major problems within Roman Catholicism and in Orthodoxy. It'd be better, more beneficial for Protestants to remain Protestant, for Roman Catholics and Orthodox to convert to Protestantism. And so I'm not saying if these things are correct, obviously, that's not even a bad agenda. It'd be a good agenda. But it's an agenda, and I think when people see it not transparent and with the sort of candy-coated surface, because Dr. Ortland is a very good presenter of information, I would guarantee you he'd be more fun to sit and listen to a normal Sunday sermon for 30 minutes than any of us and any of the apologists you follow online, because he's a better presenter, he's a better speaker. And so I think because he's able to phrase what he wants to get what he wants, And what he wants is contrary to what Orthodox want, what Roman Catholics want, and that he's persistent in it. What they're perceiving is like, this is really not ecumenical. This is evangelism. He's trying to poach our members. And so that's what it is. And I think maybe if there was a coming out, like, yes, I am trying to poach your members, I'm just not being a jerk about it, like other apologists that act like jerks about it, I think we could respect that. And so, be that as it may, so I think that's what they were perceiving. And I think there's something to what they're perceiving. It'd be wrong to completely dismiss it. And I do think that it kind of makes it, to a degree, infuriating when people say, oh, well, he's too charitable to be doing such a thing, or too charitable with this. And a lot of it's image, and some people just want it a little more straightforward. But what this shouldn't mean on the internet is, all right, we should be straightforward, so we're going to keep it real dumb, and right, and just treat each other like jerks. And I think when Dr. Ortlund's got into the Apologetics Inc. stuff, and like with the response video to that guy that converted to Roman Catholicism because of that mathematical formula or whatever that wacky thing was.
I was about to mention that, yeah.
You know, that at least he said, listen, we're just going to deal with the arguments that are made, right? Because that's what we ought to be doing. I hope that's what I did in this show, is we're just going to deal with the arguments, not with the person, not with their supposed emotions. You know, we can have those views. We can even talk privately to people about that stuff. But when we're doing this publicly, because we can't read people's minds, we got to just deal with the arguments. And I think that's what's important. So I'm going to, like I said, we're opening up some questions, and we're not going to have time. We give everyone a chance to answer everything. So let me give this to Father James, because why not? How do you think that Pope Greg the Great's comments against adoration of images portray the churchscape of the day? So do you have any inkling about that, Father James?
The churchscape of the day? Okay.
Like how the church was in its day.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm okay with the understanding that we go from a that there is. See, I'm okay with my own position having nuance and development, because I don't believe it's a dogma. I believe it is a practice that develops within the centuries of the church. So we develop things as a mere practice. My issue is when it comes to the demand of veneration, specifically for images. I think that's where it becomes a problem. So I don't have much beyond that to say. Okay. But I did want to talk about the Bertuzzi thing very quickly, if that's all right.
All right. Well, yes, Father, you may.
All right. So, I'm sorry. Ortlund was one of the people Bertuzzi was talking about before Bertuzzi became Roman. And I think that affected Ortlund, not in a sort of like, oh, what am I going to do way, but like, he's like, oh, I need to start defending Protestantism because there are all these misrepresentations. Because even after talking with Ortlund and everything, Bertuzzi, when he had that big, long interview with Frad about becoming Roman, he's just constantly giving so many just false understandings of Protestantism because he's listening to the Catholic Answers people who are okay with lying or misrepresenting Protestantism. And so that's why Ortlund's doing this, I believe.
All right, so we got this question, which is on the church fathers. How do the Protestants in the panel determine who and who isn't a church father? For example, there's a distinction in origin to telling the likes of Gregory and Basil. So, Other Paul, what's your view of that? Do you think that the Orthodox view, Roman Catholic view, the church fathers too inclusive, or what do you think is appropriate?
Yeah. I think, well, in fundamental sense, we all have the same kind of criteria. That is like some degree of orthodoxy and location within the church, within the historic church. And so people like the Valentinian sects or the Montanists, see you later. They didn't even pretend to be of the same church. Otherwise, though, I think there is the necessity of not, as Orthodox and Romanists tend to do, not always, because some will actually grant the title of father can be given to those even who don't have perfect orthodoxy. But otherwise, the East, from what I see, is much more restrictive in keeping like the church fathers and the saints as kind of like synonymous terms. And that's why many will say that likes of Tertullian and Origen are not fathers. Whereas I'd say that cannot reasonably be maintained because they were, at least with Tertullian, he was in the church for a while. And even after he went off and did his own thing, even afterwards, his contributions and writings were highly appreciated and foundational to many other saints, like Cyprian, for example. Likewise with Origen, who always remained within the institutional church, and even with his very heretical views, in my opinion, I 100% grant that, he was nonetheless highly regarded and highly influential in many other fathers later on. And so I think, look, if Origen isn't a church father, no one is. I genuinely believe that because of how much of a scale he was. And so for me, the standards, it's a mix of like I'll admit it's kind of vague, but I think it's kind of unavoidable. A kind of vague sense of orthodoxy, even with errors here and there, even big ones, and also like location. They're within the milieu of the church. That's what I'd say.
Now, we got this here, which I'll answer. Is there a legitimate critique to be made when someone shifts to refuting others and complaining about their errors? We certainly see that's the case of those in the cage stage. And my comment would be, it does seem like Apologetics Inc. is a business made for appealing to cage stage people that are very insecure, they're new in something, or they're about to jump ship into something else. A lot of people don't stick with it. Like the people following me 3 years ago probably aren't the same people following me now. And that's a big part of it. And because these emotions are running high, I think the apologists play off this. The response video genre with picking beefs with, most embarrassingly was Mike Lofton and picking a beef with Father Peter Hears because Father Peter Hears quoted someone else. And then his whole interpretation of that quote was just totally wrong and ignorant. And it's just like, he was just obviously doing it for attention to make money. And so it's like, there's a problem here where we're playing off people's insecurities, off people's desire to see controversy. And I hate to say it, I think it gets the best of all of us because we're sinful human beings, but it's not something that should be done. We should be sticking with content. I'm condemning the televangelist aspect of apologetics. That's why I'm happy I make no money doing this, and I don't want to make money doing this. Let me now pose this to you guys. Does anyone on this show here, amongst you, uphold the practice of relic veneration? Why or why not? So we'll go around the horn. We'll go with you first, River. Do you uphold relic veneration, and why or why not?
Oh, I guess it depends on what you mean by veneration. But I believe that relics can and maybe even should be displayed publicly for people to see, so long as they're not, sometimes it gets a bit grotesque, to be honest. And I think it's biblical. We see that even the handkerchiefs of St. Paul and Peter were passed around, and people would touch them to cure diseases and that sort of thing.
So you don't discount that could happen today with a Christian relic of some sort?
I'm still making my mind about some issues, such as to do with like miracles and that sort of thing. I would say that you should not expect a relic to give you some sort of miraculous blessing or something like that. I think an important. I would say no. You cannot venerate. You cannot venerate relics in the traditional sense of the word venerate, because in Acts, when Cornelius bows before Peter, he says, don't do that. And in Revelation, when John bows before the angel in heaven, the angel says, don't do that. So, I think there's civic venerate. There's a civic bowing.
You're taking a U-turn on the show. Interesting. So, other Paul, your view, venerate relics, yay or nay, and why?
Yeah, similar. I'm very, very similar with River's view. I'll explicitly say that, like, with respect to bowing and kissing them, I'd say no, because it's very much superfluous, and you're more or less just venerating a dead material object rather than the invisible God himself. Otherwise, though, with the other cases, like displaying them in someone's honor, in memory of them, didactically, and the theoretical possibility that someone's shin bone or their handkerchief could heal someone. It's possible. I'm a charismatic. That's totally open for me.
Yeah, God works miracles.
But same with River though. It's not something you should expect and treat like, oh look, this is a relic. If I touch it, if I do something, it's going to do some. That's just getting into superstition. Yeah.
And Father James, same question.
Yeah, so my position is pretty similar. One of the issues I have is that we keep using this term veneration, and I don't think we all have the same exact understanding of how that works out. Part of that is cultural, but also part of that is theological.
But about however we show affection, I mean, could we show affection to a relic?
Of course, yeah.
And does this affection, could it be a means of grace for the person from the saint? Because I think that's really what relic veneration is.
A means of grace from the saint.
Yes, because
I'd have to.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to get into more because I would say grace flows from God, obviously, and yes, you could talk about going through. So I guess you could say physically it's connected, sure, but I mean, we receive grace and anywhere, everywhere, all throughout time in history. It's just sort of everywhere. It's like it's better than the force, the grace of God. So I guess in that sense, sure.
It seemed to me from the panel, it's you guys will admit the theoretical possibility that God could work through such a medium, but it's obviously been, in your view, a medium, well, I'd even say so, that's been abused and it's been ritualized and it becomes very problematic. I want to, before we do plugs, I like this vote of confidence here. This conversation has been excellent. I had a pretty negative view of Eastern Orthodox before this video, but I subbed because I do like Craig's attitude. Good stuff.
He's the exception to the rule.
But yeah, that's pretty humbling because I don't know how great I am. I'm grateful that people will listen to me pontificate. So let's do our plugs. I will do mine first, which would be, if this has blessed you, please go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. The link is below. And the reason is to help support evangelism in Cambodia. We have a missionary that follows the show that will be going there soon. And you could actually help that missionary by, let me share screen, by buying books that they're looking for, and they're only available here, and we need someone to bring to Cambodia. So we'd be mailing them to him, and he'd be bringing them there. So this would include this liturgical scriptures bundle. If you donate $100 or $99.95, then you'll be the reason why these books make their way to Cambodia. So please consider that. If that is a little too pricey for you, there's also this book, which I'm going to, the Didache, where I don't know why Father Paisi doesn't want to just download it off the internet. Maybe because they use translators over there. They're Presbyterians. They might want the paper book to translate. But there's the Didache for $4.95. You could help support Evangelism Cambodia by bringing these texts over. But we also just need more than that. Just general, consistent donations to pay for expenses, to pay for repairs to the churches. There is for anyone that is rich, they want to buy land in Siem Reap because there already is land for a church there, but they built a Buddhist monastery next to it, and it's illegal in Cambodian law to now build another religious building of the same religion. This is very common in other countries. They need licenses and stuff just to exercise religious freedom. So that being said, they need to sell that land and buy a new plot of land. There's a plot of land that they can maybe buy for $65,000. So if you're some crazy rich person watching this and you're crazy serious about evangelism in Cambodia, well, we could put you in contact with the priest there and you could wire the money. And for those of you who don't have $65,000, $99, or $5, your prayers to raise up those that will give to help support the church are also very important. So please consider $1 to sky's the limit to support Evangelism Cambodia, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. So that's my plug. Let's go, Father James.
Well, I'm Father James. I am a rector of a parish in the South, an Anglican parish, and I have my YouTube channel, which is Barely Protestant, and I talk about Anglicanism, historic Protestantism, defenses against Roman Catholic claims, Eastern Orthodox claims, all that fun stuff. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and subscribe to that channel, it's on YouTube.
There you go. Subscribe to for more Protestant nonsense. You could go to, I don't know if you guys noticed, I called everything nonsense in the links below.
Oh, we've seen it.
All right, good. So I called my Discord nonsense, equal opportunity nonsense. So Other Paul, your turn.
100%. Yep. My channel, The Other Paul, link below on YouTube. I've also got my website and blog, theotherpaul64.com. I am trialing tutoring services right now with supporters of the two new highest tiers I've launched. So that's gone pretty awesome. I'll be doing my first one tomorrow, actually. So prayers that goes well. And eventually I'll be launching full tutoring services, various topics, whether it's historical method, church history, exegesis, and a few others as well. And I'll expand it with time. tutoring services that anyone can buy without becoming a super high tier supporter. They'll be coming out in March, I believe. That's the timeline. Otherwise, if you like,
and what's
anything,
your most recent video? What's your most recent video people should check out?
my most recent video is the one on whether the early church had the Bible. It was responding to a very silly argument by Timothy Gordon, which even many well-learned Romanists and Easterners would say is utterly ridiculous. Basically showing that even if there wasn't a single canon held to by all the early church, all the fathers and churches did have their own conception of what the canon was. Therefore, they could, in theory, practice sola scriptura. That was my latest video.
I really love any discussion of canons. It's something I find. I liked your stream that you did with River on that question. I thought it was a good stream.
Yeah. That stream was genuinely charting, like apologetically speaking, in our circles. That was some uncharted territory. So
and it might have been River's channel. I can't remember. So River, how about you tell people what you're all about?
My channel is Yuki Media, link below. I mainly talk about Anglicanism, classical Anglicanism based on the formularies, conservative Anglicanism, not woke, stupid, apostate Anglicanism. And I also do a little bit of apologetic stuff with Protestantism. So I did some stuff about the canon, how Protestants under sola scriptura understand the canon. I've got a video that started that off that I did myself. Then I've got a popular one that I did with Paul. Those are both on my channel. We had a more interesting view of the canon, that it's a little bit more open than I think some people like to say, which I if we have time, I'd actually like to just briefly hear what Craig has to say about that. But also, my most recent stuff has been, I've declared war against women priests and women pastors, and I've been doing a lot of content on that. I've got 2 videos on my channel. I've got an article about it, and I might be getting some more articles published by other sources coming in the future. So just check that out. Yeah.
And just as for my thoughts with your view of open canons, definitely a step in the right direction. As an Orthodox Christian, we have a list of canons, right? So like we would just, it's sort of, you have the right to discern between this list, a canonical list of different canons. I am partial personally to Wisdom of Solomon being on an equal level. I'm partial to Greek Esther, for example. The books of the Maccabees are historical books. I view them very important as historical sources, and they're canonical for that reason. And St. Augustine even talks about, or was it Origen? I think it was Augustine, though. He says in reference to, it was Origen. He says in reference to what they preserve about the saints, right? Like, because there's hagiographies within the books of Maccabees. So as an Orthodox Christian, the hagiographies are non-negotiable. So like our whole view of infallibility is very different. Our whole view of inspiration is very different. So it allows us to have this multiple tiered view of canon without even saying that, because it's not the top tier, it's not as important or it's more negotiable. It's just not how we would deal with the sources that way. It's the same reason why we'd say hagiographies and prayers are non-negotiable, as long as it has the consensus of the church. So I do think you guys had a lot of interesting comments. I really liked, you definitely went through, River, a lot of stuff with a lot of like the weirder sources stuff, like Shepherd Hermas and whatnot. So I thought it was interesting. I really did enjoy it.
Thank you.
And before I forget, I want to ask the audience to please pray for my son. He's got some hiccups in the childcare situation right now. So pray for my wife and I, my son, that'd be much appreciated. So guys, pray for the panel here. I want to thank you guys for coming. Thank you guys for being part of Apologetics history. For the first time, did something other than what everyone thought we were going to do. So how was that?
Excellent
Excellent.
stuff. So glad
Thanks
you
for
had
having
it.
us on. Really appreciate it.
And our love to Jimmy Akin and Trent Horn. Thank you for making the content available for us to talk critically about a lot of the points you brought up and the edification of so many. So our thanks to you. And I will end this show as I end all of them by quoting Jesus Rock by saying, "Fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day."